February 8, 2026. Super Bowl 60. Levi's Stadium, Santa Clara, California. Bad Bunny takes the stage for the most watched performance in American television history. 13 minutes. 100 million viewers. Not a single word in English. This wasn't a concert. It was a geopolitical statement disguised as entertainment. While the Trump administration deploys thousands of ICE agents across American cities. While construction crews pour concrete for border walls. While politicians debate deportation quotas. A Puerto Rican artist performs entirely in Spanish at America's most sacred cultural event. And America watched. Not just Latino America. All of America. Conservative commentators erupted immediately. Un-American. Disrespectful. This is the United States. Speak English. But something had already shifted that their outrage couldn't reverse. Spanish had penetrated so deeply into American culture that an entirely Spanish-language performance wasn't just accepted. It was celebrated, streamed, and monetized by the same corporations that fund politicians promising to secure the border. This is the paradox that defines 2026. America builds physical walls while cultural boundaries dissolve. Politicians promise to preserve American identity, while teenagers learn Spanish on Duolingo to understand Bad Bunny's lyrics. Billions are spent on border enforcement, while algorithms deliver Spanish-language content to millions of English-speaking Americans who voluntarily consume it. The wall at the southern border now stretches over 700 miles. It represents the most extensive border fortification in American history. It cost over $50 billion. It employs tens of thousands of agents. And it's completely irrelevant to the actual transformation occurring. Because the real border isn't physical. It never was. The real border is cultural, linguistic, demographic, and that border dissolved years ago, penetrated not by migrants crossing deserts but by music streaming through fiber optic cables, by intermarriage blurring racial categories, by demographic momentum that no enforcement can reverse. This documentary examines how America is fighting a cultural war it already lost. How the tools of power, walls, deportations, enforcement, are deployed against forces they cannot control. And how the very nation built by European colonizers now desperately defends an American identity that is itself an act of historical theft and demographic replacement. The irony is complete. The colonizers who replaced indigenous populations now fear being replaced themselves. The Spanish language, spoken on this continent before English, is treated as foreign invasion. And a wall meant to defend American culture stands powerless. While 100 million Americans voluntarily listen to Spanish music. This is the story of that paradox, and why it reveals more about power, identity, and empire than any border wall ever could. The morning after Bad Bunny's performance, the culture war's front lines became visible. Conservative media erupted. Fox News anchors questioned why Spanish dominated America's biggest stage. Social media filled with demands that the NFL keep it in English. Politicians renewed calls for English-only policies. Meanwhile, the data told a different story. Within 48 hours, Bad Bunny's performance became the most watched Super Bowl halftime show in history. 40 million streams on YouTube alone, and climbing. The streams came from Montana, Wisconsin, Iowa, states with minimal Latino populations. White teenagers in suburbs. Rural communities. The American heartland. They didn't stream it because they understood Spanish. Most didn't. They streamed it because the algorithm recommended it, because their friends shared it, because culture doesn't require translation when it's compelling enough. This is the conquest that walls cannot stop. Traditional invasion requires armies, borders crossed, territory occupied. It can be resisted with military force, border controls, enforcement. But cultural penetration requires none of these. It requires only that content be appealing enough that people voluntarily consume it. And once consumed, it changes preferences, shapes identities, influences behavior. Spotify's 2025 data revealed that Despacito, a Spanish-language song, was streamed over 8 billion times, making it the most streamed song in history. The majority of those streams came from non-Spanish speakers. TikTok's trending sounds are frequently in Spanish. YouTube's most subscribed channels include multiple Spanish-language creators. Netflix's most-watched series include productions from Mexico, Colombia, Spain. This isn't immigration. It's something more fundamental: voluntary cultural adoption by populations that supposedly oppose Spanish-language presence. Teenagers in Kansas learning Spanish not because schools require it, but because they want to understand lyrics. Families in Ohio eating tacos not as exotic ethnic food, but as routine Tuesday dinner. Americans code-switching between English and Spanish phrases absorbed from social media. This is conquest through appeal rather than force. And it's unstoppable precisely because it's voluntary. People choose it, enjoy it, integrate it into their lives without recognizing it as the cultural transformation that immigration restrictionists fear. Physical walls can stop bodies. They cannot stop bites. They can prevent people from crossing the Rio Grande. They cannot prevent cultural content from crossing every border simultaneously through networks that recognize no sovereignty. While politicians celebrate border enforcement victories, the cultural boundaries they claim to defend dissolve on 100 million American screens, voluntarily, enthusiastically, irreversibly. The empire built walls to defend territory. But territory is irrelevant when culture flows through screens, speakers, and algorithms that operate in a borderless space no enforcement can patrol. The central irony of American immigration politics: descendants of European colonizers defending American identity against demographic replacement. But American identity is itself the product of demographic replacement, the most successful and violent in human history. When English colonists arrived in Virginia in 1607, millions of indigenous people inhabited North America. They had languages, cultures, political systems, and territorial claims developed over millennia. Within 300 years, European diseases, military conquest, forced displacement, and demographic overwhelming reduced indigenous populations to less than 2% of the total. This was replacement. Actual, literal, demographic replacement. European settlers didn't assimilate into indigenous cultures. They didn't learn indigenous languages as primary communication. They didn't preserve indigenous political systems. They replaced them. Completely. The United States of America exists because of demographic replacement. The English language dominates because indigenous languages were systematically suppressed. European cultural practices became American culture because indigenous cultures were destroyed or marginalized. Now, descendants of those colonizers express anxiety about being replaced by Latino immigration. The irony approaches the absurd. Donald Trump, whose mother was a Scottish immigrant and whose paternal grandparents were German immigrants, claims that Latino immigration threatens American identity. Tucker Carlson, descended from English colonists who arrived in the 1600s, warns that demographic change will replace Americans with immigrants. But their ancestors were the replacers. The demographic change they fear is simply the continuation of the same process that created their presence on this continent. The difference: indigenous peoples couldn't stop European demographic replacement because Europeans had technological, military, and disease advantages that made resistance futile. Current American elites cannot stop Latino demographic change for different reasons. It's driven by births more than immigration, it's protected by democratic rights that didn't protect indigenous peoples, and it operates through mechanisms that enforcement cannot control. The colonizers are experiencing, in slow motion over generations, what they inflicted on indigenous populations in a few centuries. Displacement not through military conquest but through demographic mathematics. But unlike indigenous peoples, they're not being killed, not being forcibly removed to reservations, not watching their children taken to schools designed to eliminate their culture. They're simply becoming a smaller percentage of the population in a nation they once demographically dominated. And they call this invasion. The irony is lost on most. But it's the essential context for understanding American immigration politics. The fear of replacement expressed by people whose entire presence on this continent results from replacement they conducted. Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean in 1492, beginning European colonization of the Americas. Spain established the first permanent European settlement in what is now the United States, St. Augustine, Florida, in 1565. For the next 250 years, Spanish colonial power dominated much of North America: Florida, the Southwest, California, Texas. English colonization was secondary and later. Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement, wasn't established until 1607, 42 years after St. Augustine. This history is deliberately forgotten in contemporary immigration debates, because it reveals that Spanish presence in North America predates English presence. That American identity built on English language and Anglo-Saxon cultural heritage is actually the later arrival claiming primacy over earlier inhabitants. When Mexico gained independence from Spain in 1821, its territory included what are now California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and parts of Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma. These weren't empty lands. They were populated by Spanish-speaking communities that had existed for generations. The United States acquired these territories through military conquest, Texas, Southwest, and purchase, Louisiana, Alaska. In doing so, it absorbed populations that were Mexican citizens speaking Spanish. They didn't immigrate. They were incorporated through territorial expansion. Their descendants are not immigrants. They're indigenous to territories that became American through conquest. Now, 534 years after Columbus, Spanish language and Latino culture are reasserting presence across the same territory Spain once controlled. But this isn't Reconquista. It's not organized. There's no political movement to return California to Mexico. It's simply demographic momentum, immigration, higher birth rates, cultural transmission across generations, and digital cultural sharing creating Spanish language presence that increases over time. The circle completes itself not through military reconquest but through demographic mathematics and cultural appeal. Spain lost its North American empire to Anglo-American expansion. Spanish language and culture are now demographically overwhelming the same territories through mechanisms the empire that conquered them cannot control. This isn't justice. It's not revenge. It's not even coordinated. It's history operating on timescales longer than political memory, creating ironies that participants don't recognize because they don't know the history being repeated. The descendants of English colonizers who displaced Spanish colonial power are watching Spanish cultural influence return through channels they cannot block, not through military force they could resist but through births, marriages, and cultural choices that accumulate over generations into transformation no wall can prevent. San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, El Paso, Santa Fe, Las Vegas, Sacramento, San Antonio. These aren't Spanish translations of English names. They're Spanish names that existed before English speakers arrived. The geography itself remembers what American political discourse forgets. Spanish was here first. When Anglo-American settlers arrived in what is now the Southwest in the early 1800s, they found established Spanish-speaking communities, Spanish place names, Spanish legal systems, and Spanish cultural practices. They didn't rename everything in English. The names remained Spanish because they were already established. This creates a peculiar situation, Americans demanding English-only policies in states whose names are Spanish, whose cities have Spanish names, whose geography was mapped and named by Spanish speakers. The linguistic archaeology reveals priority. And priority undermines contemporary claims that Spanish is a foreign invasion threatening American linguistic integrity. If Spanish is foreign to America, why are so many American places named in Spanish? If English is the natural American language, why did Anglo settlers adopt Spanish place names rather than replacing them? The answer: Spanish wasn't foreign. It was the established language of the territories being incorporated. English was the foreign intrusion, the language of military conquerors imposing new governance on existing Spanish-speaking populations. Over generations, English became dominant through institutional power, economic necessity, and educational policy. Spanish-speaking populations were marginalized, their children educated in English, their language relegated to private spaces. But it never disappeared. Spanish continued in families, communities, and regions where demographic concentration made its persistence possible. Now, reinforced by continued immigration and higher birth rates, Spanish is resurging in the same territories where it was the original European language. This isn't foreign invasion. It's linguistic persistence, a language reasserting presence in territories where it was spoken before English arrived. Contemporary Americans treating Spanish as threatening foreign presence are ahistorical. They assume English primacy that's actually quite recent in much of American territory. 200 years is not very long in linguistic terms. Languages spoken for centuries don't disappear because political power changes. They persist in place names, family practices, and cultural memory. And when demographic conditions allow, they resurge, not as foreign invasion but as indigenous language reclaiming space in territories where it was never truly absent. The Trojan horse was a military strategy. Hide soldiers inside a gift, wait for enemies to bring it inside their walls, then attack from within. Cultural penetration works similarly, but without the violence. Music is the perfect Trojan horse. It enters not through force but through appeal. People voluntarily bring it inside their borders, their homes, their minds. And once inside, it changes things. Despacito was released in January 2017. The same month Trump was inaugurated, promising to build the wall and restrict immigration. By summer 2017, it was the #1 song in America. Americans who couldn't speak Spanish were singing Spanish lyrics. Radio stations that normally played only English songs were playing Despacito on repeat. Trump built barriers while Americans voluntarily consumed Puerto Rican and Colombian culture through their speakers and headphones. The song was inescapable. It played in shopping malls, gyms, restaurants, cars. You couldn't avoid it without avoiding public space entirely. This is cultural penetration that enforcement cannot stop. ICE can raid workplaces. Border Patrol can intercept river crossings. But they cannot prevent Americans from choosing to stream Spanish-language music. And music is never just music. It carries language, cultural aesthetics, values, and perspectives. Listening to Bad Bunny doesn't just mean hearing sounds. It means absorbing Puerto Rican Spanish, Caribbean musical traditions, and cultural references from Latin America. Repeated exposure creates familiarity. Familiarity reduces perceived foreignness. And reduced foreignness undermines political narratives about threatening cultural invasion. How can Spanish be a dangerous foreign language when your 14-year-old daughter voluntarily learned it from TikTok to understand her favorite artist's lyrics? This is the Trojan horse mechanism. Culture enters through voluntary adoption, making it impossible to resist without controlling what people choose to consume. Authoritarian regimes try this. China controls internet access, North Korea prohibits foreign media, Iran censors Western music. But the United States cannot do this without abandoning fundamental freedoms that define its political identity. So the cultural Trojan horse enters unchallenged. Americans freely choose Spanish-language music, Latino-owned restaurants, Mexican television shows dubbed in English. Each choice seems individual and apolitical. But aggregated across millions of people over years, these choices transform culture more effectively than any immigration policy. The wall cannot keep out what people voluntarily let in. Bad Bunny's Super Bowl performance wasn't the first Spanish-language moment in American mainstream culture. But it was the most visible declaration that Spanish no longer needs English permission to occupy American cultural space. Previous Latino artists who achieved mainstream American success, Shakira, Ricky Martin, Jennifer Lopez, did so partly by performing in English. They code-switched, Spanish for Latino audiences, English for crossover mainstream success. Bad Bunny refuses this bargain. He performs exclusively in Spanish. He doesn't pursue American success by linguistic accommodation. He asserts that Spanish itself belongs in American culture without requiring translation. His success proves the assertion correct. Un Verano Sin Ti, his 2022 album entirely in Spanish, was the most streamed album globally on Spotify. It topped the Billboard 200, the first Spanish-language album to achieve this. His tours sell out arenas across the United States, including cities with minimal Latino populations. And now, the Super Bowl, the most American of American cultural events, watched by 100 million people, the ultimate mainstream platform. 13 minutes. All Spanish. No apology. No English translation. The performance included El Apagón, a song criticizing gentrification in Puerto Rico, and Titi Me Pregunto, about Caribbean romance and sexuality. These aren't culturally neutral pop songs. They're distinctly Puerto Rican cultural expressions delivered without modification for American audiences. And Americans watched. Not just tolerated, celebrated. Social media exploded with praise. Streaming numbers shattered records. This represents a fundamental shift. Spanish-language culture no longer requires English validation to be considered American culture. It asserts presence and demands recognition on its own terms. For immigration restrictionists, this is the nightmare scenario. Cultural transformation occurring not through illegal immigration they can combat with enforcement, but through voluntary adoption by Americans themselves. You cannot deport a language when American citizens are choosing to learn it. You cannot wall off culture when Americans are streaming it voluntarily. Bad Bunny's performance was silent invasion. Silent because it involved no force, invasion because it occupied the cultural center of American life without asking permission. 100 million Americans watched Spanish-language performance, and most didn't complain they couldn't understand every word. They simply enjoyed it. This is how cultural wars are lost. Not through military defeat but through voluntary adoption by populations who stop seeing the foreign as threatening and start seeing it as entertaining. Spotify doesn't check immigration status before recommending songs. YouTube doesn't verify citizenship before suggesting videos. TikTok's algorithm doesn't care about English-only policies. Netflix streams Mexican shows to American viewers without requiring border crossings. This is the fundamental vulnerability in enforcement-based immigration restriction. Digital culture operates in space where borders are technologically meaningless. The algorithm's sole criterion is engagement. What keeps users watching, streaming, clicking? If Spanish-language content achieves high engagement, the algorithm recommends it, regardless of viewer language, nationality, or political views about immigration. A teenager in rural Nebraska who has never met a Latino immigrant, whose parents voted for Trump, who lives 1,500 miles from Mexico, gets recommended Bad Bunny because the algorithm detected that people with similar listening patterns enjoyed it. She clicks. She likes it. The algorithm recommends more Spanish-language music. She streams it. Her listening habits change. Her cultural preferences expand. This process repeats millions of times daily, creating cultural penetration that operates beneath political awareness. Parents who oppose immigration don't realize their children are absorbing Spanish-language culture through phones and tablets. They couldn't stop it if they tried. Controlling internet access completely is practically impossible in modern American households. The algorithm's borderlessness creates cultural circulation that mirrors historic globalization but operates at digital speed. Where previous cultural exchange required immigration, people physically moving, trade, goods crossing borders, or mass media, centralized cultural production, digital culture requires only internet access. And internet access is nearly universal in the United States. This means every American with a smartphone is potentially exposed to every culture on Earth, filtered and recommended by algorithms optimized for engagement rather than national cultural preservation. Border enforcement is helpless against this. You can build walls, deploy agents, conduct raids, but you cannot prevent algorithms from recommending Spanish-language content to Americans who voluntarily watch it. China attempts this through the Great Firewall, controlling internet access to prevent foreign cultural influence. But such control requires authoritarianism incompatible with American political values. So the border remains permeable where it matters most, in the cultural space where preferences form, identities develop, and the future is shaped. The algorithm doesn't recognize borders. And increasingly, neither do the Americans whose culture is being formed by what algorithms recommend. In 2023, TikTok's most viral sound was Peso Pluma, a Mexican regional music genre called corridos tumbados. The artist, Peso Pluma himself, was relatively unknown in the United States before TikTok. Within months, his music dominated American feeds, was streamed billions of times, and influenced American pop music production. This happened without radio airplay, without record label promotion, without traditional media gatekeeping. It happened because TikTok's algorithm detected that users engaged with the sound, watching videos using it, creating their own content with it, sharing it. The algorithm amplified it. Americans consumed it. Culture changed. This pattern repeats across platforms. Spotify discovers Latin music is highly engaging, creates playlists mixing English and Spanish songs, exposes English-speaking listeners to Spanish-language artists they'd never encounter otherwise. YouTube recommends Spanish-language content to viewers whose watch history suggests they might enjoy it, regardless of language barriers. Instagram connects American users with Latin American cultural content through visual media that doesn't require language comprehension. Each platform operates as cultural bridge, connecting Americans to global content based on engagement rather than geography or language. The result: cultural walls dissolve. Previous generations experienced culture through geography-bound institutions, local radio stations playing locally relevant music, television networks broadcasting nationally appropriate content, movie theaters showing domestically produced films. These institutions functioned as cultural gatekeepers, filtering what reached audiences based on language, national origin, and perceived cultural appropriateness. Digital platforms eliminate these gatekeepers. Content succeeds based on engagement metrics, not cultural appropriateness judgments. If Americans engage with Spanish-language content more than English alternatives, algorithms promote Spanish content, even to users who don't speak Spanish. This creates feedback loops. Exposure increases familiarity, familiarity increases engagement, engagement increases algorithmic promotion, promotion increases exposure. The result is accelerating cultural circulation that operates independently of, and often contrary to, political preferences about cultural preservation. American teenagers are learning Spanish from TikTok comments, picking up Mexican slang from YouTube videos, developing musical tastes shaped by global rather than national cultural production. Their parents might vote for politicians promising cultural preservation. But their children's culture is already globalized, hybridized, and increasingly comfortable with Spanish-language presence. This generational divide will determine America's cultural future. And the algorithm has already chosen which side wins. The Trump administration has now spent over $50 billion on border wall construction, maintenance, surveillance technology, and enforcement personnel since 2017. $50 billion. For comparison, Spotify's entire annual revenue is approximately $13 billion. YouTube's global revenue is around $30 billion. TikTok generates about $20 billion annually. The platforms delivering Spanish-language culture to hundreds of millions of Americans cost less to operate globally than America spent trying to keep Spanish speakers out. And the platforms are winning. Every dollar spent on the wall prevents some physical crossings. But it cannot prevent the cultural penetration that matters more for America's long-term demographic and cultural trajectory. Despacito has been streamed over 8 billion times. If each stream represents 1 minute of cultural exposure to Spanish language and Puerto Rican/Colombian culture, that's 8 billion minutes, 15,000 years, of cultural influence delivered at near zero cost. The wall prevented perhaps 200,000 border crossings in 2025. Impressive enforcement number. But Despacito alone reached more Americans in 1 year than crossed the border illegally in a decade. Which has more cultural impact? 200,000 people physically present in border communities, or 8 billion cultural exposures distributed across the entire American population. The economics are devastating for enforcement advocates. Cultural penetration achieves vastly greater reach at vastly lower cost than physical immigration. Bad Bunny doesn't need to cross the border. His music crosses it 8 million times per day through Spotify streams alone. He doesn't need a visa. His cultural influence operates in legal space where visas are irrelevant. He can't be deported. He's a U.S. citizen from Puerto Rico, and even if he weren't, deporting him wouldn't remove his music from American devices. The wall is the wrong tool for the problem it claims to address. It's attempting to solve a cultural challenge with physical infrastructure, a category error guaranteed to fail. $50 billion bought hundreds of miles of steel and concrete barriers that stand in empty desert. Those billions could have funded English-language education programs, cultural integration initiatives, economic development in sending countries, or dozens of approaches that might actually address root causes of migration. Instead, it funded monuments to the illusion of control, walls that stand physically impressive but strategically irrelevant while Spanish-language culture penetrates American life through channels the walls don't touch. The wall will eventually crumble, requiring more billions for maintenance. But the songs will remain, archived digitally, infinitely reproducible, permanently accessible. Future historians will see the wall as we see the Maginot Line, an expensive defensive fortification rendered obsolete by adversaries that bypassed it entirely. September 11, 2001, 19 terrorists, primarily Saudi nationals, killed nearly 3,000 Americans using hijacked airplanes. None of them crossed the southern border. None of them were Mexican. None of them were Central American. None of them entered the United States illegally. They came on legal visas, primarily through airports, from Middle Eastern nations. Yet the primary long-term domestic consequence of 9/11 was the militarization of the southern border and the securitization of Latino immigration. This wasn't logical. It was opportunistic. The Bush administration and subsequent administrations used the security framework created for counterterrorism to address immigration from Latin America, a problem that had nothing to do with terrorism but could be reframed as a security threat in the post-9/11 environment. The transformation was structural. The Immigration and Naturalization Service was abolished and its functions transferred to the Department of Homeland Security, explicitly linking immigration to national security. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, became an internal security force with powers and budget that would have been politically impossible before September 11th. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, expanded from approximately 10,000 agents in 2001 to over 60,000 personnel by 2025. The border became militarized with surveillance technology, drones, sensors, and tactical equipment designed for counterterrorism but deployed against economic migrants. This securitization served multiple purposes. Politically, it allowed politicians to appear strong on security by targeting visible immigrant populations rather than addressing complex intelligence failures that allowed 9/11. Economically, it created massive budgets for border security contractors, technology firms, and detention facility operators, an industry worth tens of billions annually. Culturally, it provided framework for treating Latino immigration as existential threat rather than economic or humanitarian issue. The rhetorical shift was crucial. Before September 11th, unauthorized immigration was primarily discussed as an economic and legal issue. After September 11th, it became a security threat. This reframing justified measures that would have been politically unacceptable otherwise: family separations, mass deportations, detention without trial, and militarized enforcement. The irony: while resources were redirected toward the southern border, actual security vulnerabilities remained unaddressed. The 9/11 hijackers' visas were approved by systems that remained largely unchanged. Airport security improved, but visa vetting for potential terrorists from relevant countries faced political resistance because it might offend allies or appear discriminatory. So America got tough on Mexican agricultural workers while remaining diplomatically careful with Saudi nationals, despite Saudis being the primary 9/11 perpetrators. This wasn't security policy. It was political theater using security as justification for immigration restriction that had nothing to do with terrorism. The Latino immigrants targeted by post-9/11 enforcement weren't terrorists. They were economic migrants seeking work. But they were visible, politically vulnerable, and convenient targets for demonstrating security. 25 years later, the securitization framework remains in place, having successfully transformed immigration from a complex policy issue into a security threat that justifies enforcement measures regardless of their effectiveness. George W. Bush's presidency is remembered for the Iraq War, the War on Terror, and the 2008 financial crisis. But his most enduring domestic legacy is the institutional framework that transformed immigration enforcement into a security apparatus. Before Bush, immigration was primarily an administrative matter handled by the Immigration and Naturalization Service within the Department of Justice. Enforcement was relatively limited, focused mainly on border areas, and operated with modest budgets. After Bush, immigration became a homeland security issue managed by massive enforcement agencies with counterterrorism-level resources and powers. This transformation was deliberate. The Homeland Security Act of 2002, passed in response to 9/11, reorganized the entire federal government around security. Immigration functions were transferred from the Justice Department to the newly created Department of Homeland Security. The symbolic significance was clear. Immigrants were now categorized alongside terrorists as security threats. The new structure created three agencies: Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE internal enforcement with arrest, detention, and deportation authority. Budget grew from nothing in 2003 to over $8 billion by 2025. Customs and Border Protection, CBP border enforcement and ports of entry. Budget exceeds $18 billion, making it one of the largest federal law enforcement agencies. U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS legal immigration processing, but now within security framework rather than justice framework. The budget numbers reveal priorities. Over $25 billion annually for immigration enforcement, more than FBI, ATF, DEA, and Secret Service combined. This is more than security spending. It's an industry. Private detention facilities, surveillance technology contractors, border wall construction firms, and transportation companies that move deportees all profit from enforcement. The industry lobbies for continued tough enforcement regardless of immigration trends. When unauthorized border crossings declined significantly in 2007 to 2011 due to the financial crisis, enforcement budgets continued increasing. Because the purpose was never just enforcement. It was creating a permanent security industrial complex around immigration that would justify itself regardless of actual threats. Bush also pioneered the rhetorical linkage between immigration and terrorism that Trump later exploited. In 2006, Bush warned that terrorists could enter through the southern border, a claim without evidence but politically useful. The rhetoric prepared Americans to accept immigration as security threat rather than economic or humanitarian issue. This reframing has been catastrophically successful. Public opinion shifted. In 2000, Americans were roughly evenly split on whether immigration was beneficial or threatening. By 2010, majorities viewed it primarily as a security concern. Bush created the infrastructure. Obama maintained and expanded it, deporting more people than any previous president. Trump weaponized it, using the security framework to implement the most aggressive enforcement in American history. And now the framework is permanent, embedded in government structure, budget priorities, and political discourse. Bush's real legacy isn't the wars abroad. It's the war at home against immigrants, justified by terrorism but targeting people who have nothing to do with terrorism. The USA Patriot Act, passed 45 days after September 11th, is remembered for expanding government surveillance, allowing warrantless wiretaps, and reducing civil liberties protections. But buried in its 342 pages were provisions that fundamentally transformed immigration enforcement. Provisions that had nothing to do with preventing terrorism but everything to do with controlling movement. Section 411 expanded grounds for excluding and deporting immigrants based on vague associations with groups deemed threatening. No evidence of individual wrongdoing required. Mere membership in organizations the government deemed problematic was sufficient. Section 412 allowed indefinite detention of immigrants suspected of terrorism connections without charges or trial. Suspected required no evidence. The Attorney General's discretion was sufficient. Section 414 required implementation of entry-exit tracking systems to monitor all foreign nationals entering and leaving the United States, creating the infrastructure for mass surveillance of immigrant movement. These provisions were justified as counter-terrorism measures. But they've been used almost exclusively against ordinary immigrants who have no terrorism connections. The entry-exit tracking system, for instance, was designed to prevent terrorists from overstaying visas. In practice, it's used to track all foreign visitors, students, workers, creating a database of movement patterns for millions of people who pose no security threat. The indefinite detention provision was justified for al-Qaeda operatives. In practice, it's been used to hold asylum seekers and unauthorized immigrants in detention for years while their cases are processed. The expanded deportation grounds allowed removal of people with any connection to organizations designated as terrorist, a designation the government can apply without public evidence. This has been used to deport immigrants for political associations, charitable donations to organizations later deemed problematic, and even family relationships. The pattern is consistent. Counterterrorism authority was granted under emergency conditions, then systematically repurposed for routine immigration enforcement. Why? Because counterterrorism provides political cover for enforcement measures that would face opposition if honestly described as immigration control. Americans are willing to accept significant liberty reductions to prevent terrorism. They're more ambivalent about whether preventing unauthorized immigration justifies similar measures. So the measures are justified as counterterrorism but implemented as immigration control. The Patriot Act also created information sharing requirements between immigration agencies and intelligence agencies, again justified for terrorism prevention but creating infrastructure for surveillance of immigrant communities generally. Local police departments were encouraged to share information about immigrants with ICE. Hospitals and schools were pressured to report unauthorized immigrants. Communities were turned into surveillance networks. This wasn't about preventing terrorism. No major terrorist plot has been disrupted through local police reporting unauthorized immigrants to ICE. It was about creating a surveillance state targeting immigrant communities, using terrorism as justification for measures that serve immigration restriction goals. The Patriot Act's hidden purpose was transforming America into a society where movement, presence, and association could be monitored, controlled, and punished, not for actual threats but for the administrative violation of existing without proper documentation. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq created a generation of veterans trained in counterinsurgency, equipped with military hardware, and experienced in treating foreign populations as potential threats requiring constant surveillance. When these wars wound down, the veterans, equipment, and tactics came home. And they were deployed at the southern border. This wasn't metaphorical militarization. It was literal, actual military equipment, actual military veterans, actual military tactics applied to immigration enforcement. Equipment, mine-resistant ambush-protected, MRAP vehicles designed for Iraq were transferred to Border Patrol. Military drones used in Afghanistan conduct surveillance along the border. Night vision technology, thermal imaging, and communications equipment from the wars now monitor the Rio Grande. Personnel, veterans with combat experience, are actively recruited by CBP and ICE. Their training in treating populations as threats translates directly to immigration enforcement. Tactics, counterinsurgency strategies, surveillance, intelligence gathering, rapid response, overwhelming force, are applied to catching unauthorized border crossers. The 1033 program, which allows transfer of military equipment to law enforcement, has provided immigration agencies with hundreds of millions in military hardware. The result is border enforcement that resembles combat operations more than law enforcement. Migrants aren't criminals being arrested, they're targets being intercepted. The language itself reveals the military framing, tactical infrastructure, area denial, situational awareness, force multiplication. This militarization serves multiple functions. Psychological, it frames immigration as invasion requiring military response, justifying increasing budgets and expanding authority. Economic, it provides markets for military contractors as defense spending decreases, redirecting resources from foreign wars to domestic enforcement. Political, it demonstrates toughness and provides visual evidence of action. Militarized borders look impressive in political ads even if they're strategically ineffective. But militarization has costs. Military approach treats everyone as potential enemy, creating adversarial relationships with communities and individuals who aren't threats. Migrants fleeing violence are treated as enemy combatants. Children are processed through chain-linked detention facilities that resemble prisoner-of-war camps. Families seeking asylum face tactical gear-equipped agents who treat surrender as capture. This isn't appropriate for humanitarian issues or administrative violations. Military force is designed for defeating enemies, not managing civil matters. The militarization also creates escalation dynamics. As enforcement increases in one area, migration shifts to more dangerous routes. This creates more deaths, which create pressure for more enforcement, which creates more dangerous routes, a cycle that resembles counterinsurgency more than policy. The war came home from Afghanistan and Iraq. It's now being fought along the Rio Grande against people whose crime is seeking work or safety. And like the foreign wars, this domestic war is unwinnable, not through military means, because the causes are economic and political, beyond what force can address. But the military approach continues because it serves political purposes regardless of effectiveness. Security theater. Measures designed to create the appearance of security without meaningfully improving actual security. TSA agents at airports confiscating water bottles while sophisticated vulnerabilities remain unaddressed. Border walls in some areas while the border remains porous elsewhere. Deportation raids that generate headlines while most unauthorized immigrants remain. But security theater, while ineffective at its stated purpose, is extremely effective at achieving unstated purposes. Creating jobs, generating contracts, demonstrating political action, and building institutional power. The border security apparatus is security theater on an empire-building scale. Over 60,000 CBP employees, 20,000 ICE agents, $25 billion in annual budgets, hundreds of detention facilities, thousands of contractors, all justified by securing the border against threats that are largely exaggerated or mischaracterized. The empirical reality: unauthorized immigration reached its peak around 2007 and has declined significantly since. The unauthorized immigrant population has been roughly flat or declining for 15 years. Border crossings in 2025 are far below historical highs. Most unauthorized immigrants in the United States entered legally and overstayed visas, making border walls irrelevant to their presence. Yet enforcement budgets increased throughout this period of declining unauthorized immigration. Why? Because the purpose isn't actually reducing unauthorized immigration, it's maintaining and expanding an enforcement empire that provides employment, contracts, and political benefits regardless of immigration trends. This is how bureaucratic empires work. They create self-justifying rationales for expansion, measure success through metrics they control, arrests, apprehensions, enforcement actions, rather than ultimate goals, reduced unauthorized presence, and lobby for continued funding by emphasizing threats rather than achievements. ICE arrests make headlines demonstrating enforcement. But those arrests don't reduce the unauthorized population if they're immediately replaced by new arrivals, or if they target people who've been here for decades rather than recent crossers. The wall generates construction contracts and political press conferences. But it doesn't significantly reduce crossings if people simply go around it, tunnel under it, or arrive by other means. The detention facilities generate revenue for private contractors. But they don't address why people migrate: economic disparities, violence, climate change, political instability. This is security theater at scale, expensive, visible, politically beneficial, and strategically ineffective. But the ineffectiveness doesn't matter politically. What matters is the appearance of action, the demonstration of commitment, and the employment and contracts the system generates. The security theater built an empire, not an empire that secures the border, but an empire that secures budgets, justifies institutional expansion, and provides political benefits through visible enforcement regardless of actual outcomes. And like all empires, once built, it becomes self-perpetuating, defended by those who benefit from its existence regardless of whether it achieves its stated purposes. Immigration and customs enforcement didn't exist before 2003. It was created by combining functions from the former INS with customs enforcement. The stated purpose: protect national security by enforcing immigration laws and investigating customs violations. The actual function: become the deportation force that targets long-term residents, separates families, and creates fear in immigrant communities regardless of security relevance. ICE's budget is over $8 billion annually. It employs over 20,000 people. It maintains hundreds of detention facilities holding approximately 40,000 people on any given day. Who are these people? Not terrorists. Not violent criminals, primarily. Mostly ordinary people whose offense is unauthorized presence or overstaying visas. ICE's own data shows that the majority of people detained and deported have no criminal record or only minor violations like traffic offenses. Many have been in the United States for decades. They have U.S. citizen children. They own homes, run businesses, pay taxes. Their communities consider them members, not threats. But ICE targets them through workplace raids, traffic stops, and targeted enforcement operations that separate families and destroy communities. The Trump administration's zero-tolerance family separation policy in 2018, forcibly separating thousands of children from parents at the border, became ICE's defining image. Global outrage forced the policy's official end. But family separation continues through routine deportations. Parents deported while children remain, or citizen children forced to leave with deported parents to countries they've never known. This creates impossible choices: abandon children or force them to leave the only country they've known. ICE defends this by claiming it's simply enforcing law. But enforcement involves discretion. ICE chooses to prioritize long-term residents with family and community ties over recent arrivals with no connections. Why? Because established residents are easier to find. They have addresses, jobs, children in schools. They aren't hiding in the shadows, they're living openly in communities that know them. Targeting them generates arrest numbers that justify budgets and demonstrate enforcement activity. Recent arrivals without established presence are harder to locate and detain. They require investigative work rather than showing up at known addresses. So ICE takes the path of least resistance, targeting people who are easiest to deport rather than people who pose any security concern. The result is enforcement that maximizes human suffering while minimizing security benefits, precisely backward from what a rational security agency would do. But ICE isn't primarily a security agency. It's a deportation agency using security justification to target people who threaten nothing except nativist preferences for demographic stability. The infrastructure created for counterterrorism, databases, watch lists, screening procedures, intelligence sharing, was justified as preventing attacks. But it's been systematically repurposed for general immigration restriction, targeting people who have no terrorism connections. The Terrorist Screening Database, TSDB, commonly called the watch list, was created after September 11 to identify known or suspected terrorists. By 2025, it contains over 2 million names. The vast majority are foreign nationals who have never been charged with terrorism-related offenses, never been found to have terrorist connections, and pose no identified threat. Simply being on the list, which requires no evidence, no charges, no judicial review, can prevent visa approval, trigger deportation proceedings, or justify indefinite detention. People are added to the list based on secret intelligence, often from foreign governments. They cannot challenge their inclusion because the evidence is classified. They may not even know they're listed until they attempt to travel or apply for immigration benefits. This is counterterrorism infrastructure repurposed as immigration control, targeting people not because they pose security threats but because adding them to databases allows denial of entry or justifies deportation. The pattern repeats across multiple systems. Biometric screening, justified for identifying known terrorists, now used to track all border crossers and create databases of immigrant movements. Social media monitoring, justified for detecting terrorist radicalization, now used to investigate visa applicants for general background checks. Information sharing, justified for connecting counterterrorism intelligence, now used to share immigration status information between agencies for enforcement purposes. Each system was created under terrorism justification with limited oversight and public scrutiny. Each has been expanded far beyond original purposes to target immigrants generally. The NSEERS program, National Security Entry-Exit Registration System, implemented in 2002, required registration and fingerprinting for male nationals from 25 countries, all Muslim majority or Middle Eastern. It was justified as counterterrorism. But it never identified a single terrorist. Instead, it subjected tens of thousands of law-abiding people to invasive surveillance, leading to thousands of deportations for minor visa violations unrelated to terrorism. The program was eventually terminated in 2011 after years of criticism. But the precedent remained. Terrorism justification can be used to implement discriminatory enforcement targeting specific populations. Trump's travel bans operated similarly, justified as terrorism prevention despite most banned countries having no citizens involved in U.S. terrorism. The real purpose was Muslim immigration restriction using security as legal and political justification. The transformation is complete. Counterterrorism became anti-immigration, security infrastructure became enforcement tools, and measures justified by preventing attacks now target people whose only offense is seeking better lives. When American immigration restrictionists want to scare audiences, they point to France. Look at France, they say. Open borders. Muslim immigration. Loss of national identity. That's America's future if we don't secure the border. France serves as cautionary tale in American conservative imagination, the nation that lost itself to demographic change. But is the tale accurate? And what does France's experience actually reveal about immigration and national identity? France's Muslim population is estimated at 8 to 10% of the total, approximately 5 to 6 million people. This is the largest Muslim population in Western Europe, both in absolute numbers and percentage. Most are immigrants from former French colonies in North Africa, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, or their descendants born in France. This population is demographically young, with higher birth rates than ethnic French, meaning its percentage will grow even without new immigration. Projections suggest Muslims could comprise 15 to 18% of France's population by 2050. For French nationalists and American observers using France as warning, this represents replacement, the gradual demographic displacement of ethnic French by populations they consider culturally incompatible. The fears are expressed openly: France won't be France anymore. Islamic culture will replace French culture. Sharia law will replace French law. These fears are amplified by terrorism. Attacks in Paris, 2015, Nice, 2016, and other incidents by Islamic extremists killed hundreds and traumatized the nation. They're reinforced by visible cultural differences. Mosques where churches stood, headscarves in schools, halal food markets, neighborhoods where French is secondary to Arabic. For observers seeking to warn America about immigration's dangers, France provides perfect evidence. A European nation losing its cultural identity to demographic change from Muslim immigration. But this narrative is selective. It ignores crucial context. Most French Muslims are integrated. They speak French, work in French economy, participate in French civic life. Surveys show over 60% identify strongly with French nationality. The challenges France faces: unemployment among minority youth, residential segregation, educational inequality, result less from immigration per se than from failed integration policies, economic conditions, and discrimination. France's rigid assimilation model demands immigrants completely abandon heritage identities to become French. But discrimination prevents full acceptance even when assimilation occurs. The result: marginalized populations belonging nowhere, not fully French despite citizenship, not connected to parental cultures they've been taught to reject. This creates the very alienation and extremism that France fears, not because Islam is incompatible with French values, but because French integration policies create conditions for failure. The lesson from France isn't that Muslim immigration inevitably produces conflict. It's that integration requires economic opportunity, anti-discrimination enforcement, acceptance of cultural pluralism, and institutional inclusion. When these exist, integration succeeds. When they don't, problems emerge, regardless of immigrants' origins. But American restrictionists don't want this complex lesson. They want simple tale: immigration from culturally different populations produces disaster. France serves that purpose perfectly, if you ignore the details. Walk through Paris in 2026 and you encounter multiple Frances simultaneously occupying the same geographic space. The 1st and 7th arrondissements, wealthy, historically French, dominated by haussmann architecture, cafés serving traditional French cuisine, churches that are tourist attractions rather than active worship sites. Then Saint-Denis, Clichy-sous-Bois, Bobigny, the banlieues surrounding Paris where over 40% of residents are immigrants or children of immigrants, where unemployment exceeds 25%, where mosques serve as community centers, where French is spoken with Arabic inflection. 2 Frances. Same nation. Increasingly different realities. The wealthy arrondissements are aging. Their populations are declining. Their birth rates are below replacement. Their cultural institutions, opera, museums, haute cuisine, are preserved but feel archaic to younger generations. The banlieues are young, growing, culturally vibrant in different ways. Music, fashion, language evolve rapidly. Identities are hybrid: French-Algerian, French-Moroccan, French-Malian. The demographic mathematics are inexorable. The aging population declines while the young population grows. Over time, the banlieue's demographics will define France more than the arrondissements. This isn't invasion. It's natural demographic transition driven by age structures and birth rates of populations already present. But it creates anxiety among ethnic French who see their familiar nation transforming into something they don't recognize. Marine Le Pen's National Rally, formerly National Front, has built electoral success on this anxiety. In the 2022 presidential election, she won 42% of the vote. Not enough to win, but enough to show that nearly half of French voters are deeply concerned about demographic change. Her message is explicit: France is losing itself. We must preserve French identity against replacement by incompatible populations. This resonates because visible change confirms the narrative. More mosques, more headscarves, more halal shops, more Arabic heard in public spaces. What the narrative ignores: France has always absorbed immigrant populations. Italians, Poles, Portuguese, Spaniards, all were once considered culturally incompatible. All integrated over generations. The difference now is religion more than culture. Previous immigrants were Christian or secular. Current immigrants include significant Muslim populations whose religious practices are more visible. This religious difference is coded as cultural incompatibility. But empirical evidence suggests integration is occurring, slower than some prefer, but occurring nonetheless. French Muslims overwhelmingly support secular governance, oppose Sharia law replacing French law, and identify as French citizens. The extremists who commit terrorism are tiny minorities, not representative of the broader population. But fear operates on visibility and anxiety rather than statistics. And Paris in 2026 is visibly different from Paris in 1986, different enough that demographic destiny feels like loss to those who remember the past. The question facing France: can French identity expand to include diverse populations, or will it fracture along demographic lines? America watches closely. Because America's demographic future looks like France's present. The banlieues are France's warning and America's nightmare. What happens when immigrant populations are geographically segregated, economically marginalized, and culturally isolated. These suburban communities surrounding French cities were built in the 1960s to 1970s to house immigrants and working-class French. The architecture is brutalist. Massive concrete housing blocks, minimal public space, efficient but dehumanizing. They were designed as temporary housing for workers needed by France's growing economy. They became permanent ghettos for populations that France imported but never integrated. Unemployment in some banlieues exceeds 40%. Among youth, it's even higher. Educational outcomes are dramatically worse than national averages. Police presence is heavy and confrontational. Services are limited. These aren't neighborhoods where people choose to live. They're places where people are economically trapped, unable to afford housing elsewhere, unable to find jobs that would allow mobility. The result is concentrated poverty, social dysfunction, and alienation from French society. Periodic riots erupt. 2005, 2007, 2018. Young people burning cars, clashing with police, expressing rage at marginalization. French government responds with increased policing, not economic investment. This creates cycles. Policing breeds resentment, resentment breeds disorder, disorder justifies more policing. The banlieues are radicalization incubators not because Islam is inherently radical but because marginalized young men with no economic prospects, no social integration, and constant police harassment are vulnerable to extremist recruitment. Most banlieue residents are not radical. But some are, and they've committed devastating terrorist attacks that traumatize the nation and justify further marginalization. This is integration failure's consequence. Populations present in the nation but not part of it, living parallel lives with minimal contact with mainstream society. For American immigration restrictionists, the banlieues prove that Muslim immigration creates permanent underclass that breeds extremism. But the lesson is more complex. Segregation, economic marginalization, and discrimination create the conditions for radicalization regardless of immigrants' religion or origin. Had France invested in integration, quality education, economic opportunity, anti-discrimination enforcement, residential integration, outcomes would be dramatically different. Instead, France chose containment. Keep immigrant populations geographically separate, police them heavily, provide minimal services, demand cultural assimilation while preventing economic integration. This approach guaranteed failure. You cannot demand people integrate while denying them opportunities that make integration possible. America faces similar choices. Will it invest in integration of growing Latino and immigrant populations? Or will it create geographic, economic, and social segregation that produces American versions of the banlieues? Current trends suggest the latter. Residential segregation increasing, school segregation persisting, economic inequality widening along racial lines, enforcement intensifying rather than integration investment. The banlieues are warning. This is what happens when societies import labor but refuse to integrate people. What is French identity? The traditional answer: French language, secular governance, laicite, Republican values, European cultural heritage, Catholic historical foundation. But what happens when millions of French citizens speak Arabic at home, practice Islam, trace heritage to Africa rather than Europe, and have cultural references from former colonies rather than French history? Are they less French? Can French identity expand to include them? Or is France fragmenting into parallel communities with incompatible identities? This is the identity crisis that defines contemporary France and previews America's future. France's assimilation model historically demanded that immigrants completely adopt French identity, speak only French publicly, keep religious and ethnic identities private, embrace Republican values above heritage cultures. This worked reasonably well for European immigrants who were culturally similar enough that assimilation felt achievable. It works poorly for North African and Sub-Saharan African immigrants whose cultural and religious differences are more significant and visible. Headscarves become political battlegrounds. France banned them in schools, 2004, and full-face veils in public, 2010, claiming these religious symbols violate secular principles. But critics note that Catholic symbols aren't similarly banned, that nuns' habits are acceptable while Muslim headscarves aren't, revealing that laicite is selectively enforced against Islam. The burkini controversy, whether Muslim women can wear full-body swimwear on public beaches, became national crisis in 2016. Some French localities banned them, claiming they violate secularism. But swimwear is swimwear. Banning specific styles based on religious motivation is precisely the religious discrimination that secularism supposedly prevents. These controversies reveal deeper anxiety. France is trying to preserve cultural identity through law, banning visible signs of difference in the hope that forced conformity will preserve French character. But identity cannot be preserved through prohibition. You can ban headscarves without changing the demographic reality that millions of French Muslims exist and will continue existing. The bans don't promote integration. They signal rejection, telling Muslim citizens that their religious practices make them unacceptably foreign even when they're French by birth. This creates the alienation that undermines integration. Why embrace French identity when French society signals that your presence is problematic regardless of citizenship? Demographic reality is that France is becoming more diverse. Identity can either evolve to include diversity, or it can rigidly resist until the gap between official identity and demographic reality becomes untenable. France is choosing resistance, preserving traditional identity through law while demographic change continues. America faces the same choice: evolve American identity to include growing Latino, Asian, and immigrant populations, or rigidly defend Anglo-Saxon Protestant identity that's demographically declining. Trump's wall represents resistance. Bad Bunny's Super Bowl performance represents reality. The question is how long resistance can continue before reality prevails. Europe is dotted with magnificent cathedrals: Notre Dame, Westminster Abbey, Cologne Cathedral, Sagrada Familia. They're architectural masterpieces, tourist attractions, and monuments to European cultural heritage. But many are empty. Church attendance in Western Europe has collapsed. These cathedrals are museums more than active worship sites. Meanwhile, mosques are being built across Europe to serve growing Muslim populations. And they're full, active worship sites with vibrant communities. The symbolism is stark: empty cathedrals representing dying Christian Europe, full mosques representing rising Muslim populations. For European nationalists, this is civilization-level replacement. Islamic culture filling the void left by Christianity's decline. The reality is more complex. European secularization has nothing to do with Muslim immigration. Church attendance began declining in the 1960s, well before significant Muslim immigration. Europeans abandoned Christianity voluntarily, not because Muslims displaced them. The cathedrals are empty because Europeans chose secularism over religious practice. The religious void is self-created. Muslims building mosques and attending them regularly doesn't create the religious void, it fills one that already existed. But the optics are powerful. European nationalists see flourishing mosques where churches once dominated and interpret this as cultural replacement rather than European secular choice. The math is straightforward: religious populations have higher birth rates than secular populations. Muslim families in Europe have more children on average than secular European families. Over time, this produces demographic shifts toward religious populations, not because of conversion but because of births. This troubles secular Europeans who spent generations escaping religious dominance. Having achieved secular society, they now face possibility of religious populations becoming significant minorities with political influence. The irony: Europeans rejected Christianity through secularization, then express alarm when another religion grows through natural demographic processes. The mosque-cathedral dynamic reveals Europe's contradictions: embrace secularism but fear religious populations, celebrate diversity but resist cultural change, import labor but resist demographic consequences. America faces similar contradictions. Christian conservatives invoke religious heritage while demographic change brings religious diversity. What happens when American mosques outnumber churches in some communities? The cultural math is simple. Birth rates determine long-term demographics more than immigration. Religious populations outproduce secular populations. Over generations, this transforms culture regardless of what political majorities prefer. Empty cathedrals and full mosques tell the story European nationalists don't want to acknowledge. Europe created the conditions for its own transformation by abandoning the Christianity it now claims to defend against Islam. Marine Le Pen's political message is simple: France first. Stop immigration. Preserve French identity, or France will disappear. She nearly won the French presidency in 2022, capturing 42% of the vote. In 2027, she might win. American immigration restrictionists watch her closely. She represents what they want: mainstream political force opposing immigration and demographic change. When Le Pen speaks, American conservatives listen. Her warnings about France are framed as warnings about America's future. We allowed mass immigration. Now we face demographic replacement. Our culture is threatened. Our identity is fragmenting. Don't let this happen to you. The message resonates with Americans anxious about Latino demographic growth, Muslim immigration, and cultural change. Le Pen provides European legitimacy to American nativism. She's not a fringe extremist. She's a serious political figure who nearly became president. If France's mainstream politics includes immigration restriction and identity preservation, American restrictionists argue, surely America can adopt similar policies without being condemned as racist. But Le Pen's near success reveals something darker: how quickly democracies can shift toward ethno-nationalism when demographic anxiety is politically exploited. Her policies include drastically reducing legal immigration, eliminating birthright citizenship, prioritizing ethnic French in employment and housing, restricting religious expression for Muslims, limiting family reunification, increasing deportations. These are explicitly designed to slow or reverse demographic change, preserving France's ethnic composition through policy. American restrictionists want identical policies. Trump has proposed most of them. But implementing ethno-nationalist policies in democracies creates tensions with liberal democratic principles: equal rights regardless of ethnicity, freedom of religion, family unity. Can democracies remain liberal while implementing policies designed to maintain ethnic majorities? Le Pen argues yes, that preserving national identity is prerequisite for democracy, and demographic change threatens the cultural foundation that democracy requires. Critics argue no, that democracy means accepting demographic change through legal processes, and that using policy to preserve ethnic majorities violates equal citizenship. This debate will define 21st century Western politics: whether democracies can maintain ethnic preferences without becoming authoritarian, whether demographic change can occur without social fracture. Le Pen's warning to America is real. But the warning isn't what she thinks it is. She warns, accept demographic change and lose your nation. The real warning: resist demographic change and lose your democracy. Because maintaining ethnic dominance against demographic trends requires increasingly authoritarian measures, restrictions on who can enter, who can marry, who can access rights, who is really considered a citizen. America can choose Le Pen's path. But it comes at costs she doesn't acknowledge: the transformation of liberal democracy into ethnocracy, the restriction of rights to preserve demographics, the fracture of civic nationalism into ethnic tribalism. The warning cuts both ways. Trump talks constantly about the Mexican border. But he watches France. Because France reveals the future he's trying to prevent: a Western nation where demographic change has progressed far enough that reversal is impossible, where identity politics dominates, where mainstream politicians must address immigration or lose elections. France is 20 to 30 years ahead of America on demographic transition. What France experiences now, America will experience in 2040 to 2050. Trump studies the playbook. Le Pen's rhetoric: national preference, cultural preservation, immigration restriction framed as protecting identity rather than racism. European right-wing parties: Alternative for Germany, AfD, Vox in Spain, Liga in Italy, all using immigration and identity to build electoral power. Brexit: British voted to leave EU partly over immigration concerns, showing that demographic anxiety can drive major political decisions even when economically irrational. Trump adopted European far-right framing wholesale. They're replacing us, great replacement theory from French intellectuals. Defend Western civilization, rhetoric from European identitarian movements. America first, echo of France first, Germany first, etc. Travel bans targeting Muslims, inspired by European calls for similar restrictions. The strategy is adapting European ethno-nationalism to American context, using fears about demographic change to build political movement that transcends traditional left-right economics. This is why Trump prefers Norwegian immigrants over Haitians, not just racism but strategic deployment of European whiteness as preferred identity model. Norway represents what America used to be: white, European heritage, Protestant-influenced culture. Haiti represents what America is becoming: multiracial, culturally diverse, African/Caribbean influenced. Trump's preference is strategic signal. America should maintain European character, not become Latin American or African in demographics or culture. France matters more than Mexico because France shows that demographic transition creates political opportunities for politicians willing to exploit anxiety. Mexico is the source of immigration. But France is the template for political response. Le Pen's near success proves that immigration restriction isn't political suicide in democracies, it's viable electoral strategy. Trump watches France and sees his path to continued political relevance, position himself as defender of American identity against demographic change, build coalition of anxious whites and conservatives, force mainstream politicians to address immigration or lose voters. This strategy doesn't require stopping immigration. It requires maintaining crisis and anxiety that justify continued restrictionist politics. The wall, ICE raids, travel bans, these aren't primarily policy tools. They're political theater demonstrating commitment to restriction, keeping the issue prominent, and signaling to anxious voters that someone represents their concerns. France shows the strategy works. Le Pen transformed from fringe extremist in the 1990s to nearly president in the 2020s. Trump aims for similar trajectory, from dismissed reality TV figure in 2015 to president, to losing office, to returning to power by exploiting demographic anxiety. France is the proof of concept. America is the larger market. And Mexico is just the convenient border where abstract anxiety can be made concrete through walls and enforcement theater. Puerto Rico has been a U.S. territory for 128 years, since 1898 when America acquired it from Spain after the Spanish-American War. Its residents have been U.S. citizens since 1917, for 109 years. Yet Puerto Rico remains a colony in all but name, subject to U.S. federal law, using U.S. currency, defended by U.S. military, but denied voting representation in Congress and presidential elections. This is colonial governance in the 21st century. And it reveals fundamental contradictions about American identity, citizenship, and who truly belongs. Puerto Rico's population of 3.2 million would make it larger than 21 U.S. states if admitted. It would receive 2 senators and approximately 4 representatives, comparable to Iowa, Connecticut, or Utah. But statehood has been denied repeatedly despite multiple referendums showing varying levels of support.
Why?
The official explanations vary. Economic concerns about Puerto Rico's debt, uncertainty about Puerto Ricans' desires, referendum results have been contested, procedural congressional requirements. The unstated reason is simpler. Puerto Rico is Spanish-speaking, culturally Latino, and adding it as a state would visibly shift American identity toward greater Latino representation. Puerto Rico's admission would mean the United States has a Spanish-speaking state. This is symbolically unacceptable to political forces invested in maintaining English-language American identity. It would also mean adding 2 likely Democratic senators and multiple Democratic representatives, shifting political balance in ways Republicans cannot accept. So Puerto Rico remains in limbo, American enough to be controlled, not American enough to be equal. This colonial relationship creates absurdities. Puerto Ricans serve in the U.S. military at higher rates than many states, but cannot vote for the commander-in-chief who orders them into combat. Puerto Ricans are subject to federal laws, but have no voting representation in the body that makes those laws. Puerto Rico receives less federal funding per capita than states for critical programs like Medicaid, despite Puerto Ricans being U.S. citizens with identical legal status. When Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico in 2017, the federal response was slower and less comprehensive than it would have been for a state, revealing the second-class status that colonial relationships create. Trump's response was particularly telling. He visited briefly, threw paper towels into a crowd like a game show host, claimed the death toll was inflated by Democrats to make him look bad, and blocked additional recovery funding. His treatment revealed what many Puerto Ricans already knew. Despite citizenship, they're not considered fully American by American political leadership. This colonial wound is both historical and contemporary. Historical in that Puerto Rico's acquisition was imperial conquest, no different than European colonialism. Contemporary in that the relationship persists 128 years later with no resolution in sight. Puerto Rico's status reveals that American citizenship has tiers: full citizenship for states' residents, diminished citizenship for territories' residents, even though both are legally identical. And the factor that determines which tier: geographic location, but also implicitly language and culture. Puerto Rico remains a territory partly because it's too Spanish to be a state. Democracy's fundamental principle: citizens have the right to vote, to elect representatives who make laws governing them. Puerto Rico violates this principle completely. 3.2 million American citizens cannot vote in presidential elections. They have no senators. Their one representative in Congress cannot vote on legislation. This is taxation without representation, the very principle that triggered the American Revolution. Puerto Ricans pay federal taxes, payroll taxes, Social Security, Medicare, federal excise taxes. They're subject to federal law, federal regulations, federal judicial authority. But they have no democratic voice in the federal government that taxes and governs them. This creates practical consequences. When Congress debates healthcare policy affecting Puerto Rico, no voting Puerto Rican representative can participate. When presidential elections determine policies that affect Puerto Rico, no Puerto Rican can vote. When the Supreme Court makes decisions about Puerto Rico's status, Puerto Ricans have no say in confirming the justices making those decisions. Democratic governance requires consent of the governed. But Puerto Ricans are governed without meaningful consent. They cannot consent to or reject the federal government's authority because they cannot participate in federal elections. This is colonialism's defining feature: governance without democratic participation. The only democratic right Puerto Ricans fully possess is participation in statehood referendums, asking permission to become equal citizens in the nation they already belong to. Congress could admit Puerto Rico as a state regardless of referendum results. It has sole authority over territorial status. But it refuses to act. Why does this matter for immigration politics? Because Puerto Rico reveals that American citizenship is conditional. Language and culture matter more than legal status. Puerto Ricans are citizens, but Spanish-speaking citizens without full democratic rights. This previews what growing Latino populations might face: formal citizenship but practical subordination, legal equality but political marginalization. Bad Bunny performing in Spanish at the Super Bowl is a Puerto Rican artist asserting visibility and cultural pride despite political marginalization. His message isn't subtle: we're American citizens. We speak Spanish. We're not asking permission anymore to be visible in American culture, even though we're still denied full democratic participation. The 3.2 million citizens without votes are a reminder that American democracy has always had exceptions, and those exceptions often fall along cultural and linguistic lines. Bad Bunny's Super Bowl performance was his most political act, more than any explicit protest song, more than any interview statement. Performing entirely in Spanish on America's biggest stage, representing Puerto Rico despite its colonial status, reaching 100 million viewers without linguistic accommodation, this was political assertion disguised as entertainment. The message: Puerto Ricans exist. We speak Spanish. We have culture worth celebrating. And we're claiming space in American life regardless of whether you consider us fully American. Bad Bunny's very presence was a challenge. Puerto Ricans can't vote for president, but a Puerto Rican can command the Super Bowl halftime show, the most expensive advertising time in American media. Advertisers paid $7 million per 30-second spot. Bad Bunny got 13 minutes. If valued at advertising rates, his performance was worth over $180 million in commercial time. Puerto Rico has no senators, but its artist has more cultural power than most elected officials. This is the paradox Bad Bunny embodies: political marginalization alongside cultural centrality. Puerto Ricans can't fully participate in American democracy, but they shape American culture through music, sports, entertainment, and increasingly through sheer demographic presence on the mainland. Over 5.8 million people of Puerto Rican descent live in the continental United States, more than live in Puerto Rico itself. They can vote in states, elect representatives, participate in democracy. This creates strange situation. Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico have no vote, but Puerto Ricans in Florida can decide presidential elections. Bad Bunny speaks to this diaspora as much as to the island. His message resonates with both. To Puerto Ricans on the island, your culture matters despite political marginalization. To Puerto Ricans on the mainland, don't forget where you came from. Maintain language and culture. Demand political power. His Spanish-language performance was deliberate assertion that assimilation isn't necessary for success, that Spanish belongs in American mainstream, that Latino culture doesn't need English translation to be valuable. Conservatives who complained about Spanish at the Super Bowl missed the point. The complaint is the point, revealing that despite formal citizenship, Puerto Ricans and Spanish speakers are still considered not quite fully American. Bad Bunny exposes this by forcing the question: if a U.S. citizen performing at an American cultural event in an American territory's language is controversial, then American citizenship must be conditional on language and culture, not just legal status. This is the message immigration restrictionists don't want delivered but cannot prevent. Culture travels regardless of borders, language persists regardless of policy, and identity is asserted regardless of permission. Puerto Rico is American but treated as foreign. Bad Bunny is American but sings in Spanish. The contradiction reveals the fiction of American identity as fixed, English-speaking, culturally homogeneous. The fiction is dissolving in real time, televised to 100 million viewers who couldn't look away. Congress has the authority to admit Puerto Rico as a state tomorrow. Single legislation, majority vote, presidential signature, done. It won't happen. Not tomorrow, not next year, likely not this decade.
Why?
The official reasons are economic, procedural, legal. The real reasons are demographic and political. The official obstacles. Puerto Rico's $70 billion debt crisis makes statehood economically complicated. Referendum results have been contested, with opponents claiming insufficient mandate. Puerto Rico would require federal resources for programs it currently receives at lower levels. These are real concerns. But they're solvable if political will existed. Debt can be restructured. Clear referendum can be held. Federal funding can be adjusted. The real obstacles are less discussable. Political power. Puerto Rico would likely send 2 Democratic senators and 4 Democratic representatives to Congress. Republicans cannot accept this shift in political balance. Cultural identity. Admitting a Spanish-speaking state symbolically changes American identity in ways that cultural conservatives cannot accept. Precedent. If Puerto Rico becomes a state, other territories, U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa, might demand statehood, further shifting demographic and political balances. Racial demographics. Puerto Rico would be the first state with Hispanic/Latino majority. This demographic shift is precisely what immigration restrictionists are fighting against. These real obstacles are politically unspeakable. So they're disguised as economic and procedural concerns. The result is permanent limbo. Puerto Rico remains colonial possession, too valuable to relinquish, too foreign to fully integrate. This has parallels to immigration politics. Unauthorized immigrants are economically valuable, they work in industries Americans depend on, but politically unacceptable. Admitting this would require legalizing them. So they remain in limbo, present and economically integrated but legally vulnerable and politically excluded. Puerto Rico and unauthorized immigrants share this status, included enough to be useful, excluded enough to be subordinated. For Congress to admit Puerto Rico as a state would require acknowledging that American identity can include Spanish-speaking, culturally Latino populations as fully equal citizens. This is exactly what immigration restrictionists are fighting against. Admitting Puerto Rico would concede the argument they're determined to win, that America can remain English-speaking, European heritage identity while becoming demographically diverse. If Puerto Rico, American citizens for over a century, cannot be granted full equality because of language and culture, what hope do immigrants have for equal acceptance? The answer is revealed through Puerto Rico's status. Formal equality might eventually be granted, but practical subordination will persist as long as cultural difference is treated as incompatibility. Congress will never make Puerto Rico a state for the same reason immigration restriction persists despite economic irrationality. Because cultural anxiety about American identity overrides economic logic, democratic principles, and even legal citizenship. Statehood for Puerto Rico and acceptance of Latino demographic change threaten the same thing: the end of America as English-speaking, European-derived, culturally homogeneous nation. Both are resisted not through honest acknowledgement but through procedural obstacles, economic excuses, and political paralysis. Puerto Rico remains a colony. Congress remains dysfunctional. And the contradiction persists. If Puerto Rico became the 51st state, it would be the first majority Hispanic state, the first Spanish-speaking state, the first state where English is not the dominant daily language, among the poorest states economically, reliably democratic politically, Each of these factors alone might be overcome. Combined, they make statehood impossible. But it's the first factor, majority Hispanic, that's truly insurmountable. Because admitting Puerto Rico as a state would symbolically concede that American states can be majority Latino, Spanish-speaking, and culturally distinct from the Anglo-Protestant heritage that conservatives claim defines America. It would establish precedent that demographic change is acceptable, even when it means entire states no longer reflect traditional American cultural composition. New Mexico is already 50% Hispanic and approaches majority-minority status. But it transitioned slowly enough that the shift was gradual, not sudden. Puerto Rico would be immediately and obviously Hispanic majority. There would be no ambiguity, no transition period, no gradual accommodation. The 51st star on the flag would represent demographic change made permanent and undeniable. This is what makes it unacceptable to politicians fighting demographic change elsewhere. Admitting Puerto Rico would undermine their entire argument. If a Spanish-speaking, Latino-majority state can be fully American, then Latino demographic growth in Texas, California, Florida doesn't threaten American identity, it just changes its composition. If Puerto Rican Spanish speakers can be trusted with full democratic rights, then unauthorized Latino immigrants can be trusted with pathways to citizenship. If cultural difference doesn't disqualify Puerto Ricans from statehood, then cultural difference shouldn't justify immigration restriction. The 51st star threatens white majority not demographically. 3.2 million Puerto Ricans wouldn't significantly change national demographics since they're already U.S. citizens. It threatens symbolically, by establishing that American states can be majority Latino and Spanish-speaking, normalizing the demographic future that immigration restrictionists are fighting. This is why statehood for Puerto Rico has become impossible despite multiple referendums and over a century of territorial status. It's why even Democratic politicians who theoretically support it won't prioritize it, because the political capital required to overcome Republican opposition could be spent on policies with broader constituencies. Puerto Rico is sacrificed to larger political calculations. Its 3.2 million citizens remain in colonial limbo because admitting them as a state would require acknowledging demographic realities that political coalitions are built on denying. The 51st star will not be added, not because Puerto Ricans don't deserve it, not because they're not American enough, but because they're too visibly Latino at a moment when Latino demographic growth is the central anxiety of American politics. The flag remains at 50 stars. The colonial relationship persists. And the contradiction between democratic principles and demographic anxiety remains unresolved. The United States defines itself against colonialism. The nation's founding narrative is anti-colonial, breaking free from British imperial rule to establish independent democratic governance. American foreign policy rhetoric consistently opposes colonialism, supports self-determination, and champions democracy globally. Yet Puerto Rico remains a 21st century colony, subject to American governance without democratic participation in that governance. This is hypocrisy so obvious it's remarkable how little it's discussed. Other colonial powers relinquished territories after World War II. The British Empire dissolved. French colonial holdings achieved independence. European colonialism ended, officially at least. But American territorial possessions persist. Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa, Northern Mariana Islands. Combined, over 4 million American citizens live in territories without full democratic rights. The United Nations maintains a list of non-self-governing territories, places that international law considers colonial possessions requiring decolonization. The United States has territories that would qualify but aren't on the list because America removed them through political maneuvering, not because they achieved self-governance. This is colonialism in legal disguise, granting citizenship while denying democratic participation, providing some benefits while maintaining ultimate control. The justifications mirror those of historical colonial powers. They're not ready for self-governance. British said this about India, France about Algeria. They benefit from our protection and resources. Belgium said this about Congo, Portugal about Angola. They haven't clearly expressed desire for independence. Spain said this about Cuba, Netherlands about Indonesia. These justifications were always cynical when other powers used them. They're equally cynical when America uses them. The truth is simpler. Territories are maintained for strategic and political reasons. Their inhabitants are denied full rights because granting them would be inconvenient, and the colonial relationship persists because it benefits the colonial power. Puerto Rico has strategic military value, bases, training facilities, geographic position. Granting independence would lose these assets. Puerto Rico has political value. Its products count as made in USA. Its GDP counts toward American economic statistics. Its people serve in military and pay federal taxes. But granting statehood would require treating Puerto Ricans as equal citizens, which is politically unacceptable for reasons already discussed. So the colonial relationship continues, denying democratic rights to millions while claiming to champion democracy globally. This hypocrisy is particularly striking given American rhetoric about Russia, China, and other powers accused of imperial behavior. America condemns Russian control over territories in Ukraine, Chinese control over Tibet and Xinjiang, and any other arrangement where populations are governed without consent. But Puerto Rico is governed without full democratic consent, and this is somehow different, somehow acceptable, somehow not colonial because it's American. The hypocrisy matters because it reveals that American opposition to colonialism was always selective, opposed when practiced by others, acceptable when practiced by America. And it matters for immigration politics because it shows that American citizenship is tiered, that full democratic rights are conditional on factors beyond legal status, and that cultural and linguistic difference can justify political subordination. If American citizens can be denied full democratic rights for 128 years because they're Spanish-speaking and culturally Latino, what does that suggest about how Latino immigrants will be treated even after naturalization? The colonial relationship with Puerto Rico is a preview. Formal equality but practical subordination, legal citizenship but political marginalization, cultural inclusion but democratic exclusion. This is the America that immigration restrictionists are fighting to preserve, where some Americans are more American than others, where language and culture determine political rights, where colonial power operates under democratic rhetoric. The hypocrisy is complete. The consequences are still unfolding. America has no official language at the federal level. English is dominant through custom and practice, not law. But multiple states have passed English-only laws making English their official language, restricting government business to English, and sometimes limiting bilingual education. The paradox: many of these states have Spanish names, Spanish geographic features, and Spanish-speaking populations that predate American control. California, from Spanish Califia, a mythical island in Spanish literature. Nevada, Colorado, Montana, Spanish words. Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, territories with centuries of Spanish presence before Anglo-American settlement. Demanding English only in states whose names are Spanish is historical amnesia approaching absurdity. It's like France demanding French only in Brittany, which spoke Breton before French. Or England demanding English only in Wales, which spoke Welsh before English. The language paradox reveals the historical inversion. The language now treated as invasive foreign threat is actually indigenous to these territories in European colonial terms. Spanish preceded English in the Southwest. English is the intrusive language, brought by settlers who conquered Spanish-speaking territories, imposed through institutions and education, and established as dominant through demographic and political power. Now, as Spanish-speaking populations grow through immigration and births, the language reasserts presence in territories where it was never truly absent. This is not invasion. It's resurgence. But to Anglo-Americans who've internalized the assumption that Southwest territories are naturally English-speaking, Spanish presence feels like foreign incursion. The paradox intensifies in cities: Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Antonio, El Paso, Spanish names for cities where English-only advocates demand linguistic exclusivity. Should Los Angeles, the Angels in Spanish, ban Spanish? Should San Francisco, St. Francis in Spanish, mandate English only? The absurdity should be obvious. But historical amnesia makes it invisible. English-only advocates argue that English unifies the nation, that shared language creates social cohesion, that linguistic fragmentation threatens national unity. These arguments have merit in theory. But they ignore that linguistic unification was imposed through conquest and suppression, not voluntary adoption. Spanish speakers in conquered territories were forced to learn English through education policy, economic necessity, and social pressure. They adopted English not because it was superior but because power operated in English. Now, as demographics shift, Spanish is reasserting through similar mechanisms: population size, economic influence, cultural appeal. The difference is that Spanish expansion is voluntary. People choose to maintain Spanish, to transmit it to children, to consume Spanish media, while English imposition was coercive. Yet the voluntary linguistic diversity is treated as threatening while the historical linguistic coercion is normalized as unity. This is power asserting itself through language policy, using unity as justification for maintaining linguistic dominance that benefits English speakers at the expense of Spanish speakers. The language paradox cannot be resolved without acknowledging historical context. Spanish is not foreign to American Southwest. English is the colonial language that displaced it. Demographic change is returning Spanish to prominence in territories where it originated, creating bilingual reality that reflects historical and contemporary demographics more accurately than English-only policies ever could. The paradox persists because acknowledging it would require admitting that American identity in the Southwest is built on Spanish suppression, and that the suppression is failing as demographics reassert linguistic diversity. January 11, 2018. Oval Office Immigration Meeting. Donald Trump asks, "Why are we having all these people from shithole countries come here?" He was referring to Haiti, El Salvador, and African nations. He continued, "Why do we need more Haitians? Take them out. And then, why don't we get more people from places like Norway?" This wasn't a policy discussion. It was explicit racial preference. White European immigrants are desirable, black and brown immigrants from poor nations are not. Trump's defenders claimed he was making economic argument, that skilled Norwegian immigrants would benefit America more than Haitian immigrants. But Norway's citizens have no reason to emigrate to the United States. They have higher life expectancy, better health care, stronger social safety nets, and comparable or higher incomes than Americans. Norwegians don't want to come to America. Immigration from Norway to the U.S. is minimal and declining. So Trump's preference for Norwegian immigrants is fantasy, wishing for immigration that doesn't exist and won't occur because the preferred immigrants have no incentive to come. Meanwhile, Haitians desperately want to immigrate because Haiti faces poverty, political instability, and limited opportunities, precisely the conditions that drive immigration. Trump's preference reveals the absurdity of immigration restriction based on origin country, wanting immigrants from places where people don't need to emigrate, while rejecting immigrants from places where people desperately need opportunity. It also reveals the racial basis of preference. Norway is overwhelmingly white. Haiti is overwhelmingly black. African nations are black. The pattern is explicit. Trump wants white immigrants, not black or brown ones, regardless of education, skills, or character. This preference isn't unique to Trump. It echoes American immigration policy from the 1790 Naturalization Act, limiting citizenship to free white persons, through the 1924 Immigration Act, explicitly favoring Northern European immigration, to the present. American immigration policy has always encoded racial preferences. What changed in recent decades is that explicit racial criteria became politically unacceptable. So the preferences operate through proxy, country of origin, skill levels, cultural compatibility, integration capacity. But Trump made the quiet part loud. He said explicitly what immigration restrictionists carefully avoid saying. They prefer white immigrants to non-white immigrants, European immigrants to African or Latin American immigrants. The Norway-Haiti comparison revealed this perfectly because no economic or security argument justified the preference. Norwegians aren't more skilled than Haitian doctors or engineers. Norway doesn't have special cultural affinity with America beyond racial composition. The preference is purely racial. White immigrants are desired regardless of whether they'll come. Black immigrants are rejected regardless of their qualifications or desperation. This racist preference shapes policy. Restrictive vetting for immigrants from African nations while European visa overstays are ignored. Harsh enforcement against Latino unauthorized immigrants while Canadian visa overstays face minimal consequences. Travel bans targeting Muslim-majority nations while white Christian nations face no restrictions. The pattern is consistent and obvious to anyone paying attention. Trump simply stated it explicitly rather than hiding it behind policy justifications. The Norway versus Haiti comment was a disqualifying moment, proving beyond doubt that racial animus drives immigration restriction for Trump and those who support him. But it didn't disqualify him. He remained president, won re-election, and continues governing with the same racial preferences guiding policy. This reveals that the preference isn't just Trump's. It's shared widely enough among American voters that openly expressing it isn't politically fatal. American immigration politics can't be understood without acknowledging this. Significant portions of the American public prefer white immigrants and oppose non-white immigration, regardless of economic or security rationales offered. Norway versus Haiti made this explicit. Nothing changed except that the quiet part was said loud. Shithole countries wasn't just offensive language. It was foreign policy based on racist hierarchy. Nations are valued based on their racial composition and poverty level, with white European nations at the top and black African nations at the bottom. This racial hierarchy determines who America wants to enter and who it rejects. Haiti is 95% black, descended from enslaved Africans who won independence through the only successful slave rebellion in history. It's poor partly because it was punished for this rebellion, forced to pay reparations to France for lost slave property, economically isolated, and repeatedly intervened in by foreign powers including the United States. American intervention in Haiti has occurred repeatedly. 1915 to 1934 occupation, 1994 intervention, 2004 intervention. Each time, America claimed to be helping, but each intervention served American interests while destabilizing Haitian governance. Then Trump calls Haiti a shithole and asks why America accepts Haitian immigrants, after American policy contributed to the conditions that drive Haitian emigration. This is circular logic approaching satire. Destabilize a nation through intervention, create conditions that drive emigration, then reject immigrants from that nation because it's unstable and poor. The same pattern applies to Central America. American intervention in Guatemala, 1954, El Salvador, 1980s, Honduras, 2009, contributed to instability and violence. These conditions drive migration to the United States. Then American politicians reject immigrants from these nations because they're violent and unstable. The shithole countries comment revealed not just racism but imperial arrogance. Nations can be destabilized by American policy, then dismissed as unworthy sources of immigration when people flee conditions that American intervention helped create. This is particularly grotesque given that the United States actively participated in the Atlantic slave trade, bringing enslaved Africans to the Americas against their will. Now, descendants of enslaved Africans seeking to voluntarily enter the United States are rejected with the same racial hierarchy that justified slavery. Africans are inferior, their nations are shitholes, they should stay where they are. The historical continuity is direct. Racial hierarchy that justified slavery operates through immigration policy that treats African and black nations as sources of undesirable immigrants. Trump's comment also revealed class and racial basis of immigration policy. Nations are judged not by their people's character or potential but by their current economic conditions and racial composition. Poor black nations, rejected. Wealthy white nations, preferred. This treats people as embodying their nation's conditions rather than as individuals with agency, potential, and rights. A Haitian doctor with specialized skills is still from a shithole country, and therefore undesirable compared to a Norwegian high school graduate from a wealthy nation. This is racial hierarchy masquerading as merit-based immigration preference. The comment should have been disqualifying, revealing unfitness for office through explicit racism incompatible with American values. Instead, it was defended, rationalized, and soon forgotten by media cycles. This normalization is more disturbing than the comment itself. It reveals that American political culture has space for explicitly racist foreign policy statements without consequences. The shithole countries comment didn't end Trump's career. It didn't change his supporters' views. It didn't shift policy. It simply made explicit what was already operating implicitly. American immigration policy is based on racial hierarchy where white European nations are preferred and black African and brown Latin American nations are rejected. Saying it explicitly rather than coding it through policy justifications didn't matter because the racism was always there, accepted by enough Americans that openly expressing it changes nothing. This is American immigration politics in 2026, explicitly racist preferences expressed by the president, supported by millions, encoded in policy, and treated as acceptable political opinion rather than disqualifying bigotry. July 14, 2019. Trump tweets about 4 Democratic congresswomen, all women of color, 3 born in the United States, telling them to go back to the crime-infested places from which they came. This is the deportation fantasy extended to its logical extreme, not just deporting unauthorized immigrants, but telling American citizens born in America to leave because they're not white. The 4 congresswomen, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, Rashida Tlaib, became known as the Squad. 3 were born in the United States. 1. Omar came as a refugee and became a naturalized citizen. All are American citizens. All were democratically elected. All have constitutional rights to be in Congress. Trump told them to go back anyway. This wasn't immigration policy. It was assertion that citizenship is conditional on race, that non-white Americans, even when born in the United States, are fundamentally foreign and can be told to leave. The "go back to Africa" trope has deep American history. It was used against black Americans during slavery, during Reconstruction, during the Civil Rights Movement, always asserting that black people don't truly belong in America regardless of how many generations their families have been present. Trump updated it for contemporary politics, extending it to Latino and Muslim Americans too. But the logic is identical. Non-white Americans aren't really American, no matter their citizenship status. This reveals what immigration restriction is ultimately about: not controlling borders or enforcing laws, but maintaining white demographic and political dominance. Because if American-born citizens of color can be told to go back to countries they've never lived in, then immigration restriction isn't about legal status, it's about race. The deportation fantasy operates on multiple levels. Level 1, deport unauthorized immigrants, ostensibly about legal status. Level 2, deport legal immigrants who commit crimes, extending beyond legal status to behavior. Level 3, revoke birthright citizenship for children of unauthorized immigrants, attacking constitutional rights. Level 4, tell American-born citizens of color to go back to other countries, pure racial exclusion. Trump reached Level 4, openly stating that citizenship doesn't make non-white Americans truly American. This is the immigration debate's endpoint. Not securing borders, but establishing that America is white people's country where non-whites are perpetual guests who can be told to leave regardless of legal status. The "go back" comment should have been career-ending. Telling American citizens to leave America is fundamentally un-American, violating every principle of citizenship and belonging. Instead, Trump supporters defended him. Republican politicians issued weak criticisms or stayed silent. The political base loved it. This revealed that significant portion of Trump's coalition agrees. America belongs to white people, and non-whites, even citizens, even elected officials, don't truly belong. This is the immigration debate's truth. Beneath arguments about law enforcement, border security, and economic impacts lies racial resentment about non-white presence in America. The resentment is so strong that it extends beyond immigrants to citizens, beyond legal status to race, beyond policy to identity. If American-born citizens can be told to go back to countries they've never lived in, then no amount of assimilation, legal status, or contribution will ever make non-white Americans fully accepted. This is what growing Latino, Asian, and immigrant populations face. Formal citizenship without full belonging, legal equality without social acceptance, voting rights without being considered truly American. The deportation fantasy isn't about immigration. It's about race. And it extends to citizens because citizenship isn't enough when race is the real criterion for belonging. The "go back" comment revealed citizenship's conditional nature in American politics. Formal citizenship grants legal rights, but social and political belonging remain conditional on race, culture, language, and perceived foreignness. This creates tiers of citizenship. Tier 1, white Americans of European descent, presumptively American, never questioned about belonging. Tier 2, black Americans, citizens for generations but historically excluded, still fighting for full equality, occasionally told to go back to Africa, despite having deeper American roots than most white Americans. Tier 3, Latino and Asian Americans, growing populations whose citizenship is acknowledged but whose cultural difference makes them seem foreign regardless of birth. Tier 4, Muslim Americans, legally citizens but politically suspected, facing surveillance and suspicion that treats them as potential threats regardless of actions. Tier 5, naturalized immigrants, legally citizens but not from here, their accents and origins marking them as forever foreign. This hierarchy operates informally but powerfully. It determines who gets questioned about where they're really from, who faces heightened security screening, who gets told to go back, who is presumed to be American versus who must prove it. The Squad experienced this directly. Despite being elected to Congress, arguably among the most American positions possible, they were told to leave America. This sends message to all non-white Americans: citizenship isn't enough. You can be born here, educated here, work here, pay taxes here, vote here, serve in Congress, and still be told you don't belong. This conditional citizenship affects millions. Latino Americans asked, "Where are you from?" And when they answer, "California," being asked, "No, where are you really from?" Asian Americans told they speak English well despite being born in the United States. Muslim Americans facing extra security screening despite being citizens. Black Americans told to go back to Africa, despite their ancestors being in America longer than most white Americans' ancestors. The conditionality reveals that American identity is racialized, constructed around whiteness as default, with non-whiteness marked as foreign regardless of legal status. This has consequences beyond hurt feelings. It affects political participation. Non-white citizens face voter suppression through ID requirements, poll closures, and intimidation, their citizenship questioned at voting booths. Economic opportunity. Employment discrimination continues, with studies showing resumes with ethnic names receiving fewer callbacks than identical resumes with white names. Physical safety. Non-white Americans face higher rates of police violence, vigilante attacks, and hate crimes, treated as threatening regardless of citizenship. Psychological belonging. The constant questioning of whether you truly belong creates psychological burden that white Americans don't face. Conditional citizenship means living in a nation where you're legally equal but socially subordinate, constitutionally protected but culturally rejected, formally included but practically excluded. The "go back" comment made this explicit. But the conditionality operates daily through microaggressions, discrimination, and exclusion that tell non-white citizens they're not fully American. As Latino, Asian, and immigrant populations grow, more Americans will experience this conditional citizenship, legally equal but socially marginalized, citizens by law but foreigners by cultural perception. The question facing America: can citizenship become truly equal regardless of race? Or will the tiered system persist, creating permanent underclass of citizens whose legal status doesn't translate into social belonging? Current trajectory suggests the latter. The "go back" comment wasn't aberration, it was revelation of how citizenship actually operates beneath formal equality. Every year, approximately $150 billion leaves the United States as remittances, money sent by immigrants to families in home countries. This is more than the GDP of many nations. More than U.S. foreign aid to all countries combined. More than the annual revenue of most Fortune 500 companies. And it represents economic argument that immigration restrictionists invoke constantly. Immigrants are draining American wealth, sending money abroad rather than circulating it domestically. Trump has repeatedly highlighted this. Billions of dollars are leaving our economy. Immigrants send money home instead of spending it here. This hurts American workers and weakens our economy. The argument has surface appeal. $150 billion sent abroad is $150 billion not spent in American communities, not taxed, not recirculated through domestic economy. But this framing is incomplete and misleading. The context restrictionists ignore. Immigrants earn this money through labor. They're not stealing it or receiving it through welfare. They work, often in difficult jobs Americans won't take, and send portions of earnings to families. The labor creates value. The work immigrants do generates economic output worth far more than $150 billion. Agriculture, construction, food service, healthcare, these industries depend on immigrant labor that creates value throughout the economy. Remittances stabilize sending countries. Money sent home reduces poverty and instability in countries like Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, reducing the very conditions that drive migration. It's indirect foreign aid that costs U.S. government nothing. Immigrants still spend most earnings domestically. $150 billion in remittances sounds large, but it represents only about 10 to 15% of immigrants' total earnings. The remaining 85 to 90% is spent in the U.S., generating economic activity, sales taxes, and business revenue. Remittances create trade relationships. Countries receiving remittances often import American goods, creating markets for U.S. exports. The economic reality is more nuanced than money leaving equals loss. But nuance doesn't work politically. The image of money flowing out of America while American workers struggle is emotionally powerful regardless of economic complexity. Western Union and MoneyGram locations in immigrant neighborhoods are visible symbols of this outflow. Lines of immigrants sending money home every week make the phenomenon concrete in ways economic data doesn't. Trump exploited this visibility. He proposed taxing remittances, taking percentage of money sent abroad to fund the wall or immigration enforcement. The proposal is economically questionable. It would reduce remittances but also reduce incentive to work legally, pushing activity into informal economy, but politically effective. It punishes immigrants for sending money home and generates revenue from them. Several states have considered remittance taxes. None have successfully implemented them due to legal and practical obstacles. But the political appeal remains, making immigrants pay for enforcement against themselves, turning the money outflow into revenue for border security. This is immigration politics in microcosm, economically complex issue reduced to simple narrative, money leaving equals bad, solution that's politically appealing but practically problematic, tax remittances, and policy that punishes rather than addresses root causes. The $150 billion flows because economic disparities between U.S. and sending countries are massive. Addressing disparities would reduce both migration and remittances more effectively than taxation. But addressing disparities requires long-term investment and international cooperation. Taxing remittances provides immediate political satisfaction. So the proposal persists despite impracticality, and the $150 billion continues flowing, visible symbol of immigrant transnational connections that restrictionists find threatening. Western Union is over 170 years old. It began with telegraphs, adapted to money orders, and now its primary business is remittances, transferring money from immigrants in wealthy countries to families in poor countries. In 2025, Western Union processed over $80 billion in remittances globally, with the U.S. to Mexico corridor being the largest single route. This is business built on economic inequality. Huge wage gaps between countries create demand for transferring small amounts of money at high fees. A construction worker in Texas earning $15 per hour can send $200 home to Mexico where it's worth far more in purchasing power. Western Union charges $10 to $15 for the transfer, a 5 to 7% fee for a service that costs them pennies to provide digitally. Multiply this by millions of transactions weekly, and Western Union extracts billions in fees from the poorest workers sending money to the poorest families. This is extraction economy operating at the bottom of the income ladder. Immigrants are charged premium prices for basic financial services because they lack alternatives. Banks often won't serve unauthorized immigrants or charge prohibitive fees for international transfers. So Western Union and competitors like MoneyGram capture the market, charging rates that would be considered predatory if applied to wealthier customers. The business model depends on immigrant labor, workers earning low wages in the U.S., willing to pay high fees to send money home. Economic inequality, wage gaps large enough that sending money home makes sense despite fees. Limited alternatives, banking barriers that force immigrants into money transfer services. Legal vulnerabilities, unauthorized immigrants can't complain about fees without risking exposure. Western Union locations cluster in immigrant neighborhoods, not as community service but as profit extraction from captive customer base. The stores are often in poor areas, alongside check cashing services, payday lenders, and other financial services that charge premium prices to serve customers excluded from mainstream banking. This is what economists call poverty premium. Poor people paying more for services than wealthy people pay, compounding economic disadvantage. For immigration politics, Western Union represents something different. Visible symbol of money leaving America. Trump proposed forcing Western Union to collect information on all remittance senders and potentially blocking transfers to certain countries or charging taxes. This would weaponize financial infrastructure against immigrants, using their need to send money home as leverage for enforcement or revenue generation. Western Union opposed this not from sympathy for immigrants but because enforcement would impose costs and legal liabilities on their business model. The proposal ultimately failed. But it revealed how immigration enforcement could extend into financial services, using economic necessity as enforcement tool. Western Union continues operating, extracting billions in fees annually from immigrant workers sending money to families living on dollars per day. The business model is exploitative, but it's legal, profitable, and politically untouchable because it serves function that mainstream banking won't provide. So the lines continue forming, the fees continue being charged, and the money continues flowing. $150 billion annually leaving the U.S. economy through storefronts in immigrant neighborhoods, enriching money transfer companies while providing lifeline to poor families abroad. This is immigration economics, exploitation and survival coexisting, profit and desperation intertwined, American wages exported to sustain families that American economy created demand for but refuses to fully integrate. American economy needs immigrant labor. This is empirical fact, not political opinion. Agriculture depends on immigrants for harvesting. Over 50% of farm workers are unauthorized immigrants. Construction relies heavily on immigrant labor, especially in growing Sun Belt states. Food service, hospitality, meatpacking, landscaping, childcare, elder care, these industries cannot function at current scale without immigrant workers. When Trump intensified enforcement in 2017 to 2019, agricultural regions faced severe labor shortages. Crops rotted in fields because farmers couldn't find workers willing to do physically demanding, low-paid seasonal labor. The economy needs these workers, but it resents them sending money to families. This is the core economic paradox of immigration politics. America wants cheap labor, immigrants willing to work for low wages in difficult conditions, but resents the full humanity of laborers, their families, their transnational connections, their communities. The ideal for employers would be temporary workers with no families, no connections, no demands, pure labor units that appear when needed and disappear when not. This was the Bracero program, 1942 to 1964. Mexican workers brought temporarily for agriculture, expected to return home when harvests ended. But humans aren't labor units. Workers have families. They form connections. Many stayed or returned repeatedly, eventually settling permanently. Current policy resembles Bracero logic, wanting workers without accepting their permanent presence or integration. This creates contradictions. Economic integration without social integration. Immigrants work in American businesses but aren't welcomed into American communities. Labor demand without legal status. Economy requires workers that law treats as illegal. Dependency without dignity. Industries depend on immigrant labor while politicians demonize immigrants. Exploitation as employment model. Low wages and poor conditions are business models, not unfortunate circumstances. The remittances controversy exemplifies this. Employers want immigrant labor at low wages, but they resent that workers send money to families rather than spending it all domestically. This reveals the underlying assumption: immigrant labor should benefit America exclusively, with no acknowledgement that workers have lives, families, and obligations beyond their employment. It's dehumanizing logic, treating workers as economic inputs rather than humans with complex lives and connections. The economic paradox is sustainable only through willful blindness. Consumers benefit from low prices made possible by low-wage immigrant labor. Employers profit from workers they can pay less than citizens would accept. Politicians gain support by denouncing the immigrants whose labor makes the economic system function. Everyone benefits from immigration while opposing it. Economic hypocrisy that persists because acknowledging it would require confronting uncomfortable truths about American economy's dependence on exploitable labor. The remittances leaving the country are symptoms of this system. Workers sending money home because wages in America, even while being exploited, exceed what they could earn in home countries. If exploitation ended and immigrants were paid fairly, they'd send less money home because they'd need more to live on in the U.S. If immigration were truly restricted, industries would face labor shortages requiring massive wage increases or automation, both raising consumer prices significantly. Neither option is politically acceptable. So the paradox continues, needing workers while resenting their families, depending on immigration while denouncing it, profiting from exploitation while claiming moral superiority. This is American immigration economics, built on contradictions that everyone participates in but no one wants to acknowledge. The immigrant economy isn't separate from the American economy. It is the American economy in critical sectors. Agriculture. Over 50% of farm workers are immigrants, with significant percentages unauthorized. Without this labor, American agriculture would collapse or require complete mechanization costing hundreds of billions. Harvesting lettuce, strawberries, tomatoes, this is physically demanding work that Americans overwhelmingly refuse to do even at higher wages. When states have tried enforcement crackdowns, crops rotted because native-born workers didn't apply even for jobs paying above minimum wage. Construction. Immigrants comprise over 25% of construction workforce, concentrated in trades like roofing, concrete work, framing, physically demanding specialties with high injury rates. The construction boom in Texas, Florida, and other Sun Belt states is possible only because of immigrant labor. Without it, housing costs would be dramatically higher or construction would slow significantly. Food service. Restaurants in major cities often have 50 to 70% immigrant workforce, concentrated in back-of-house positions, dishwashers, prep cooks, line cooks. The restaurant industry would fundamentally transform without immigrant labor, either closing many establishments or dramatically raising prices to attract native-born workers. Meatpacking, arguably the most immigrant-dependent industry. Over 30% of meatpacking workers are immigrants, often in harsh conditions with high injury rates and low pay. This industry deliberately recruits immigrant labor, often in rural areas where the work is so undesirable that only desperate workers accept it. Hospitality, hotels, resorts, cleaning services, heavily immigrant workforces doing physically demanding work for modest pay. Elder care. As America ages, demand for home health aides and nursing home workers grows. These positions are increasingly filled by immigrants willing to do difficult, low-paid care work. Landscaping. Visible immigrant workforce that suburban Americans see regularly but don't want to do themselves. These aren't marginal sectors. They're fundamental to American economy and daily life. Without agricultural immigrant labor, food prices rise dramatically. Without construction immigrant labor, housing becomes more expensive. Without food service immigrant labor, restaurants close or raise prices significantly. Without elder care immigrant labor, America's aging population lacks affordable care. The economic dependence is complete. American economy in its current form cannot function without immigrant labor in these sectors. Yet political discourse treats immigration as optional, something America can restrict or eliminate without major consequences. This is fantasy. The real choice is between Option 1. Acknowledge dependence and create legal pathways for workers economy requires. Option 2. Maintain current system where workers are needed but kept legally vulnerable, creating exploitable underclass. Option 3. Dramatically raise wages in these sectors to attract native-born workers, accepting major price increases consumers will hate. Option 4. Massively invest in automation, eliminating millions of jobs while requiring hundreds of billions in capital investment. Current policy is Option 2. Needing workers but keeping them vulnerable, benefiting from their labor while denying them rights. This is economically functional but morally indefensible, building economy on exploitable labor force denied legal protections. The immigrant economy isn't separate. It's integrated throughout American economic life, growing food, building houses, serving meals, caring for elderly, maintaining landscapes. Without it, American economy would require fundamental restructuring. With it, America maintains living standards that depend on workers it refuses to fully acknowledge or integrate. This is the economic reality that immigration restriction ignores. You cannot build walls against workers whose labor you depend on without devastating the economy that depends on them. Your salad exists because of immigrant labor. Almost certainly. The lettuce, tomatoes, strawberries, avocados, someone picked them by hand, likely an immigrant working for low wages in difficult conditions. This isn't exaggeration. Over 50% of agricultural workers are foreign-born, with significant percentages lacking legal status. The work is physically brutal. 10 to 12-hour days during harvest season. Bent over or kneeling in fields. Exposure to pesticides, heat, sun. Piece rate pay, paid per quantity picked, not hours worked. No benefits, no overtime, often no breaks. Housing in crowded, substandard conditions. Seasonal work with no income security. Wages average $13 to $17 per hour for work that Americans overwhelmingly refuse to do. When farms have tried recruiting native-born workers, even at higher wages, they get few applicants and high turnover. The work is too hard, too seasonal, too poorly compensated for Americans with other options. This creates absolute dependence on immigrant labor. Without it, either wages rise dramatically, perhaps to $25 to $30 per hour, to attract workers, raising food prices significantly. Automation replaces workers, requiring massive investment in harvesting technology that doesn't exist for many crops. Production moves abroad, losing American agricultural jobs entirely. Food becomes scarce or expensive, impacting all Americans but especially poor families. None of these options is politically attractive. So the current system continues. Underpaid immigrant labor picking food that Americans eat while politicians denounce the workers. The hypocrisy is visible every time you eat. That strawberry, picked by immigrant worker making $14 per hour. That salad, every component harvested by immigrant labor. That avocado toast, immigrants picked the avocados, prepared the bread, served it at the cafe. American food system is built on immigrant labor at every stage: planting, harvesting, processing, transporting, preparing, serving. Without this labor, American diet would look completely different. More expensive, less diverse, more reliant on processed foods that can be produced with automation. Fresh produce is affordable because immigrant workers pick it for low wages. This is subsidy to American consumers paid by workers who have no legal protections and can be deported for doing the work Americans depend on them doing. The contradiction is complete. Americans demand cheap food. Cheap food requires low-wage labor. Native-born Americans won't do the work at wages that keep food cheap. Immigrants will, but are denounced for their presence. Politicians promise to deport agricultural workers, but won't acknowledge that doing so would devastate agriculture. Trump's ICE raids occasionally targeted agricultural regions. Farmers protested, not from compassion but from self-interest. They need these workers. Some farmers support immigration reform providing legal status for agricultural workers. But they face political bases demanding restriction, creating tension between economic interests and cultural politics. The result is paralysis. Agriculture needs immigrant workers, economy depends on them, consumers benefit from their labor, but political system treats them as threats to be removed rather than workers to be protected. Who picks your food? Immigrants doing work Americans won't do, for wages Americans won't accept, so Americans can eat affordably while politicians denounce their presence. This is American agriculture, and it cannot function any other way without fundamental transformation that no one is willing to fund or accept. 40% of U.S.-born Latinos marry non-Latino whites. This isn't a minor demographic detail. This is demographic transformation at its most intimate and irreversible level. Every interracial marriage creates family where racial and ethnic boundaries become meaningless. Every mixed heritage child embodies the demographic change that immigration restrictionists fear. And it's accelerating. In 1967, when the Supreme Court struck down bans on interracial marriage in Loving v. Virginia, only 3% of marriages were interracial. By 2015, 17% of all marriages. By 2025, over 20% of new marriages, with much higher rates among young people. Latino-white intermarriage is particularly high. Among U.S.-born Latinos, 40% marry non-Latino whites. Among Asian Americans, over 45% marry outside their ethnicity. These rates are far higher than black-white intermarriage, still around 10 to 15%. The high intermarriage rates reveal something immigration restrictionists don't want to acknowledge. Cultural and racial boundaries are far more permeable than nativist narratives suggest. If 40% of U.S.-born Latinos are marrying whites, creating mixed heritage children, then claims about unbridgeable cultural incompatibility are empirically false. People are literally forming families across the boundaries that politics treats as fixed and threatening. This has cascading effects. Personal. When your son-in-law is Mexican-American, your grandchildren are mixed heritage, abstract anti-immigration politics becomes personal complication. Political. Families with mixed heritage members vote differently than ethnically homogeneous families, more likely to oppose harsh immigration enforcement. Cultural. Mixed heritage families are bilingual households where cultural hybridity is daily reality, not political abstraction. Demographic. Children of intermarriage complicate racial categories. Are they Latino? White? Both. Their self-identification varies, making demographic projections unstable. The intermarriage revolution is undoing racial categories that American politics and identity depend on. When demographers predict America will become majority-minority by 2045, they're using categories that intermarriage is rendering meaningless. If 40% of Latinos marry whites, and their children identify variably as Latino, white, or both, what does Latino mean demographically? If someone is half Mexican, quarter Irish, quarter Italian, are they white? Latino. Mixed. Does it depend on appearance? Self-identification. Social context. The categories are dissolving. Intermarriage is the solvent. This is assimilation's ultimate form. Not cultural erasure, but literal biological merging of populations previously kept separate. And it's happening voluntarily. People choosing to marry across ethnic and racial lines at rates that would have been unthinkable 2 generations ago. For white Americans anxious about demographic replacement, intermarriage is the worst-case scenario and the most likely future simultaneously. Worst case because it creates mixed heritage populations where whiteness is diluted rather than preserved. Most likely because it's already happening, accelerating, and cannot be prevented without authoritarian intervention in private family decisions. You can build walls at borders. You cannot build walls in bedrooms. You can restrict immigration. You cannot prevent citizens from marrying whom they choose. The intermarriage revolution is transforming America more profoundly than immigration alone could, creating families where demographic change is embodied in children who are simultaneously Latino and white, American and connected to heritage cultures. These children will define American future. They're already here, in schools, playing sports, consuming culture that reflects their hybrid identities. And no wall can prevent them from existing. No deportation can remove them. No policy can undo the demographic reality their existence creates. The bloodlines are blurring. The boundaries are dissolving. And the future is mixed. For white Americans who oppose immigration, intermarriage creates profound personal contradictions. Your daughter marries a Mexican-American man. Your grandchildren are mixed heritage. They grow up bilingual, speaking Spanish with their father's family, celebrating both American and Mexican traditions. Now what? Do you maintain opposition to immigration while your grandchildren embody demographic change? Do you support deportations while your son-in-law's cousins might be unauthorized? Do you vote for politicians denouncing Latino culture while your grandchildren participate in that culture? This isn't hypothetical. It's happening in millions of American families right now. The politics of immigration are abstract until they become personal. And intermarriage makes them personal in ways that transform attitudes. Before intermarriage, those people are threatening outsiders, easy to oppose and resent. After intermarriage, those people include your son-in-law, your grandchildren's heritage, family you love. Studies show that intermarriage is one of the strongest predictors of changing attitudes on immigration. People with mixed heritage family members oppose harsh enforcement and support immigration reform at much higher rates. This isn't about political persuasion. It's about love overriding abstraction. When your grandson comes home speaking Spanish he learned from his father, you don't see threatening foreign language. You see your grandson expressing part of his identity. When your granddaughter celebrates quinceañera, Latino coming-of-age tradition, you don't see cultural invasion. You see meaningful rite of passage for girl you love. Personal connection humanizes what politics demonizes. And as intermarriage rates increase, more Americans will experience this transformation. Approximately 30 to 40 million Americans have mixed heritage family members through intermarriage. 2045, that number could exceed 100 million as current mixed heritage children grow up and form families. This creates massive political shift over time, from abstract opposition to immigration toward personal investment in inclusive policies that benefit mixed heritage families. But the personal stakes cut both ways. Some families fracture over intermarriage. Parents who reject children's choices to marry across racial lines. Grandparents who cannot accept mixed heritage grandchildren. The rejection is rare but not unknown. Some Americans value racial purity above family relationships. But most choose family over politics. They maintain opposition to immigration broadly while making exceptions for their immigrants, the son-in-law, the grandchildren's heritage. This creates cognitive dissonance, opposing immigration while benefiting from immigrant family members, voting for restriction while celebrating cultural diversity in personal life. The dissonance is psychologically uncomfortable. Over time, most people resolve it by adjusting politics to match personal reality rather than maintaining abstract opposition that conflicts with lived experience. This is how attitudes change, not through argument but through personal relationships that make abstract positions untenable. When your grandchildren speak Spanish, Spanish stops being threatening foreign language and becomes part of family reality you accept and eventually celebrate. When your family celebrates both Thanksgiving and Dia de los Muertos, cultural diversity stops being threat and becomes richness. The personal stakes of intermarriage are transforming American politics from the ground up, one family at a time, creating personal investments in inclusive policies that benefit the mixed-heritage Americans who are increasingly everyone's family members. The ultimate irony of American immigration politics. Europeans who committed history's most successful demographic replacement now fear being replaced themselves. When English colonists arrived in North America in the 1600s, they found a continent inhabited by millions of indigenous people with established societies, languages, cultures, and territorial claims. Within 250 years, European settlers had reduced indigenous populations by over 90% through disease, warfare, and displacement, seized virtually all indigenous land, suppressed indigenous languages and cultures, established European languages, cultures, and political systems as dominant, redefined themselves as Native Americans despite being recent arrivals. This was demographic replacement on scale and speed never matched in human history. Indigenous populations declined from estimated 5 to 15 million to under 250,000 by 1900. European-descended populations grew from 0 to over 60 million in the same period. The replacement was so complete that European settlers' descendants now claim indigenous status, calling themselves native-born Americans, despite their presence resulting from recent immigration and conquest. This linguistic inversion reveals the amnesia. Colonizers who replaced indigenous peoples now use native to describe themselves and immigrant to describe others. But in historical terms, all European-descended Americans are immigrants or descendants of immigrants who arrived in the last 400 years, a blink in human history. The oldest European-descended families in America trace roots to 1600s. That's 15 to 20 generations, far shorter than indigenous presence spanning 15,000 plus years. Yet these recent arrivals now oppose immigration using arguments about protecting native population and preserving American culture. The arguments would be absurd if they weren't so historically consistent. Every wave of established immigrants opposes new arrivals using identical logic their predecessors used against them. English colonists opposed Irish immigrants in the 1800s, despite English being immigrants themselves a few generations earlier. Established white Americans opposed Italian and Jewish immigrants in early 1900s, using the same arguments used against English, Irish, and German immigrants previously. Now, descendants of those European immigrants oppose Latino immigration, using arguments about cultural incompatibility, unwillingness to assimilate, and threatening demographic change. But these arguments apply equally to the people making them. European immigrants didn't assimilate to indigenous cultures, they replaced them. European immigrants didn't learn indigenous languages, they imposed their own. European immigrants didn't integrate into existing societies, they created new societies that displaced indigenous ones. If the standard applied to Latino immigration were applied to European colonization, every American of European descent would be descended from illegal immigrants who stole land, refused assimilation, and committed demographic replacement. This historical irony is lost on most Americans because the replacement is complete enough that it's normalized. European colonization succeeded so thoroughly that its violence is forgotten and its results are treated as natural baseline. Now, facing demographic changes far more modest and peaceful than those their ancestors inflicted, European-descended Americans claim victimhood, describing as invasion what is actually gradual demographic shift through legal immigration and natural births. The colonizers became natives in 15 generations. Now they fear being replaced by actual natives of the hemisphere, Latino populations with indigenous ancestry, and recent immigrants following the same patterns their ancestors followed. History isn't repeating, but it is rhyming. The demographic churning that created European-dominated America is now creating Latino-influenced America. The colonizers' descendants don't appreciate the irony. Generation 1, 1607 to 1640 English colonists in Virginia. They know they're foreigners on indigenous land. They maintain English identity, English customs, English loyalty to the crown. Generation 2, 1640 to 1670 children born in Virginia. They're English by heritage but American by birth. Identity is hyphenated, English-American, conscious of dual connection. Generation 3, 1670 to 1700 grandchildren of original colonists. They've never seen England. Virginia is the only home they know. Indigenous peoples have been killed or displaced enough that colonists dominate the landscape. By Generation 3, the theft is complete and forgotten. The land feels like it was always theirs, indigenous presence has been erased enough to be ignorable. English identity has weakened, few have visited England, connections are distant. American identity has strengthened, this is home, fought for, built up, claimed as birthright. The colonizers have become, in their own minds, natives. The theft that created their presence is forgotten or justified. This three-generation transformation repeats throughout American history. Irish immigrants, 1840s to 1870s, arrive as despised foreigners. By 1920s their grandchildren consider themselves native-born Americans opposing Italian immigration. Italian immigrants, 1880s to 1920s, arrive as suspected criminals. By 1970s their grandchildren consider themselves native-born Americans opposing Latino immigration. Current pattern, Latino immigrants arrive as suspicious foreigners. Their grandchildren will likely consider themselves native-born Americans, possibly opposing whatever immigration wave comes next. The pattern is consistent. Within 3 generations, immigrants transform into natives in their own minds, forgetting or minimizing their immigrant origins. This creates permanent irony. Every generation of natives opposing immigration is descended from immigrants who faced identical opposition and made identical claims to belonging. But collective amnesia erases this pattern. Each wave of established immigrants believes they're fundamentally different from new arrivals. Our ancestors came legally, ignoring that legal/illegal distinction is modern invention. Our ancestors assimilated, ignoring multi-generational process where early immigrants maintained heritage cultures for generations. Our ancestors were culturally compatible, ignoring that Irish, Italian, Jewish immigrants were considered culturally incompatible by established Americans. The three-generation transformation creates Americans who genuinely believe they have indigenous claim to land their grandparents immigrated to. This isn't cynical lie, it's sincere belief enabled by forgetting. The forgetting is structural. Schools teach selective history emphasizing American founders while minimizing indigenous genocide and European colonization's violence. Family histories emphasize immigrant hardship and success while minimizing displacement of others. National mythology celebrates nation of immigrants while treating current immigrants as threatening exceptions. The result is population descended entirely from recent immigrants who consider themselves natives and oppose immigration. The theft is forgotten. The transformation is complete. And the irony is invisible. This matters because it reveals that native versus immigrant is temporary distinction. Today's immigrants are tomorrow's natives. Today's natives are yesterday's immigrants. The categories shift across generations, always favoring whoever currently holds power. Latino immigrants arriving now will have grandchildren in 2070s who consider themselves native-born Americans, possibly opposing whatever immigration wave arrives then. And those grandchildren will have forgotten their grandparents' immigrant struggles, just as current Native Americans have forgotten theirs. The cycle continues: theft, forgetting, claiming nativity, opposing new arrivals, whose descendants will repeat the pattern. 3 generations is all it takes to transform colonizers into natives. And America has proven this transformation cycle repeats endlessly, each generation forgetting they were once the outsiders they now oppose. St. Augustine, Florida. Founded 1565 by Spanish colonists. Oldest continuously inhabited European-founded city in the United States. Jamestown, Virginia. Founded 1607 by English colonists. Celebrated as first permanent English settlement in America. The dates reveal what American historical memory obscures. Spanish colonization of what is now the United States predates English colonization by 42 years. By the time English settlers arrived in Virginia, Spanish missions existed throughout Florida, the Southwest, and California. Spanish was being spoken, Spanish law was being applied, Spanish culture was being established. English colonization was the late arrival, not the original European presence. Yet American historical narrative inverts this. English colonization is treated as foundational: Jamestown, Plymouth Rock, the original 13 colonies. Spanish colonization is treated as foreign, something that happened elsewhere, Mexico, South America, rather than in territories that became the United States. This inversion serves political purpose, defining America as fundamentally English/Anglo-Saxon rather than acknowledging Spanish presence and influence. But the archaeological and historical record shows. Spanish missions in New Mexico date to 1598, 9 years before Jamestown. Spanish settlements in Texas date to 1680s, before English colonization extended beyond the Atlantic coast. Spanish colonization of California began in 1769, but Spanish explorers had mapped the coast centuries earlier. When the United States acquired these territories through conquest and purchase, 1800s, it absorbed Spanish-speaking populations that had been established for centuries. These weren't immigrants entering an English-speaking nation. They were established populations incorporated into an expanding English-speaking empire. Their presence predates American control. Spanish was spoken in Santa Fe before English was spoken in New York. Catholic missions operated in California before Protestant churches existed in most of the future United States. But American historical memory treats Spanish presence as foreign incursion rather than original European colonization. This forgetting is strategic. If Americans acknowledged that Spanish presence predates English presence in much of the United States, it would undermine claims that Spanish language and Latino culture are foreign to America. If Americans acknowledged that the Southwest was Spanish-speaking before it was English-speaking, it would complicate narratives about English being America's natural language. If Americans acknowledged that Catholic missions established European civilization in parts of America before Protestant colonization, it would challenge Protestant-centered American identity narratives. So the priority is forgotten or minimized. Spanish colonization is treated as Mexican history, not American history, despite occurring in territories that are now American. This allows contemporary Americans to treat Spanish language and Latino culture as recent foreign intrusions, rather than acknowledging their reassertions of presence that predates English dominance. When Spanish is spoken in New Mexico, it's not foreign language invading, it's indigenous European language of that territory reasserting itself after a period of English linguistic dominance. When Latino culture is visible in California, it's not cultural invasion, it's cultural resurgence of populations that were there before Anglo-Americans arrived. The forgotten priority reveals that American identity is constructed on selective historical memory. Remembering English colonization as foundational. Forgetting Spanish colonization as prior. Remembering westward expansion as settlement. Forgetting westward expansion as conquest of Spanish-speaking territories. Remembering immigration as recent phenomenon. Forgetting that English speakers were immigrants to Spanish territories they conquered. Historical amnesia serves contemporary politics, allowing Americans to oppose Spanish language and Latino culture as foreign without acknowledging they predate English-speaking American control of much of current U.S. territory. The Spanish missions came before English colonies. But American memory inverts the timeline to support Anglo-Saxon identity narratives. This inversion is coming undone as Latino populations grow and Spanish language reasserts historical presence. The forgotten priority is being remembered, not through history books but through demographic reality. Future historians will study the Trump border wall the way we study the Great Wall of China, Hadrian's Wall, the Berlin Wall, as monuments revealing the fears, power dynamics, and futility of their eras. The Great Wall of China, built to keep out barbarian invasions. Failed. China was conquered multiple times despite the wall. Now it's tourist attraction and symbol of Imperial China's defensive mindset. Hadrian's Wall, built by Romans to mark civilization's boundary against barbaric tribes. Failed. Roman Empire collapsed. Barbarians became Europeans. Now it's archaeological site and hiking trail. The Berlin Wall, built to prevent East Germans from fleeing to West. Symbolized Cold War division. Lasted 28 years before being torn down, its fragments sold as souvenirs. Each wall was built from fear of invasion, fear of contamination, fear of losing control. Each wall ultimately failed at its purpose. Each wall is now remembered more for what it revealed about builders' anxieties than for what it achieved. Trump's wall will join this list. Future Americans in 2075 to 2100 will visit the wall as historical curiosity, remnant of early 21st century demographic anxiety when white Americans attempted to preserve majority status through physical barriers. They'll learn that the wall cost over $53 billion in construction and maintenance, money that could have funded education, infrastructure, integration programs. The wall failed strategically. Unauthorized immigration continued through other means. Demographic change accelerated through births. Cultural penetration occurred digitally. The wall succeeded politically, providing symbolic demonstration of commitment to restriction that mobilized anxious voters. The wall traumatized communities, splitting families, destroying wildlife habitats, militarizing border regions. Future historians will note the futility. building industrial-era physical barrier against post-industrial demographic and cultural forces that operated through mechanisms walls couldn't touch. They'll observe the irony. Descendants of immigrants building walls against immigrants, colonizers defending stolen land against people whose territory they conquered. They'll analyze the symbolism, last desperate attempt by declining demographic majority to preserve dominance against inevitable change. And they'll ask the question that every monument to fear eventually faces: was it worth it? The answer will likely be no, because the future the wall attempted to prevent arrived anyway. 2045, America became majority-minority despite the wall. Bilingualism, Spanish became normalized in American life despite enforcement. Cultural hybridity, American culture absorbed Latino influences despite resistance. Demographic change, births and generational replacement transformed America despite immigration restriction. The wall will stand as monument not to successful border security but to futile resistance against historical forces larger than any wall could contain. Future Americans, majority non-white, many with immigrant heritage, comfortable with cultural diversity, will view the wall with a mixture of curiosity and shame. Curious about the fears that drove construction. Ashamed that their ancestors responded to demographic change with exclusion rather than inclusion. This is how history judges monuments to fear, not as successes but as warnings about what happens when societies choose walls over bridges, exclusion over integration, resistance over adaptation. The wall will not be remembered as Trump imagines, as decisive moment when America secured its borders and preserved its identity. It will be remembered as Berlin Wall is remembered, as expensive, futile barrier that symbolized its era's anxieties before being rendered irrelevant by forces it could not contain. Future generations will ask, why build walls when bridges would have served better? Why spend billions on enforcement when integration investment would have created better outcomes? Why traumatize communities through deportations when legal pathways would have achieved same economic benefits without human costs? The answers will reveal not strategic thinking but demographic panic, irrational fear driving expensive, destructive policies that failed at stated objectives. This is what the future remembers, not the wall as triumph but as monument to fear, not as success but as futility, not as strength but as weakness disguised as toughness. The wall stands. History judges. And the judgment is already being written by the demographic change the wall could not prevent. There are children being born today, in 2026, who will be voting adults in 2044, just as America approaches majority-minority status. These children will inherit the wall. And they will likely tear it down. Not through dramatic protest or revolution. Through budget decisions, policy changes, and simple lack of interest in maintaining monuments to anxieties they don't share. Why they'll tear it down? They're growing up in diverse America. Their schools, neighborhoods, friend groups are multiracial and multicultural. Diversity isn't threatening, it's normal. They're digitally native. They consume global culture effortlessly. Spanish language content is part of their media diet, not foreign intrusion. Many have immigrant heritage. By 2045, over 50% of young Americans will be non-white or have recent immigrant ancestry. They won't maintain walls designed to exclude people like them or their families. They're economically pragmatic. When they control budgets, they'll ask why billions are spent maintaining expensive barrier that doesn't generate economic value. They see climate migration coming. By 2045, climate displacement will be major global issue. Walls won't stop climate refugees. Adaptation and integration will be necessary. They won't inherit their grandparents' fears. Demographic anxiety about white majority status won't resonate with generation that grew up post-majority minority. The children who will tear down the wall are in kindergarten now. Maria, half Mexican, half white, bilingual, comfortable in both cultures. Why would she maintain wall excluding people like her father's family? Jamal, Black American with Caribbean immigrant grandparents. Why would he fund enforcement targeting immigrant communities? Aisha, daughter of Muslim immigrants, grew up facing discrimination post 9/11. Why would she support walls built from same xenophobic logic that targeted her family? Ethan, white American with Latino classmates and friends, learned Spanish through immersion. Why would he oppose bilingualism that enriches his life? These children don't share their grandparents' worldview. They're growing up in different America, one where the wall seems like anachronism from paranoid past. By 2045 to 2050, when their voting adults controlling policy. The wall will be 25 to 30 years old, requiring expensive maintenance while serving no clear purpose they recognize. Demographic change will be complete, making the wall's original purpose, preserving white majority, obviously failed and irrelevant. Climate migration will create new challenges requiring cooperation, not walls. Economic integration with Mexico and Latin America will make the wall economically counterproductive. Cultural penetration will be so complete that opposing Latino culture will seem as absurd as opposing Italian culture seems now. When budget discussions occur, someone will propose, why are we spending $2 billion annually maintaining a 40-year-old wall that doesn't serve current policy goals? The answer will be, because it's always been maintained. And the response will be, that's not a reason. Defund it. The wall won't be torn down in dramatic ceremony. It will be slowly defunded, maintenance will lapse, sections will crumble, and eventually it will be archaeological relic, remnant of early 21st century demographic anxiety. Some sections might be preserved as historical sites, reminders of when America chose walls over bridges, exclusion over integration. Tour guides will explain, in the 2020s, Americans were afraid of demographic change. They built this wall attempting to prevent it. As you can see from our diverse nation today, the wall failed. Demographic change occurred anyway. But the wall cost billions and traumatized communities. We preserve it as warning about choosing fear over adaptation. The children who will tear down the wall are being born now. They're in schools, playgrounds, daycares, growing up in diverse America, consuming global culture, forming identities that the wall was built to prevent. They will inherit the wall. They will judge it. And they will almost certainly choose to let it crumble, symbol of an anxious age that their generation has moved beyond. The wall's builders won't live to see this. But it's coming, as inevitable as the demographic change the wall attempted to prevent. The children are growing. The future is forming. And the wall's days are numbered. The wall is built. ICE conducts raids. Deportations occur. Enforcement intensifies. Then what? This question is never asked because the answer is uncomfortable. Even if enforcement succeeds completely at stopping new unauthorized immigration and deporting millions, demographic change continues through births and legal immigration. Even if the wall is 100% effective, cultural penetration occurs digitally, beyond wall's reach. Even if all unauthorized immigrants are removed, the causes of immigration, economic disparities, violence, climate change, persist, creating continued pressure. Enforcement has no endpoint. It's a perpetual project requiring endless resources without achieving permanent resolution. After the wall, what? Scenario 1. Enforcement succeeds, unauthorized immigration stops. Result: labor shortages in agriculture, construction, services. Economic disruption. Consumer prices rise. Industries relocate abroad. Enforcement celebrates victory while economy suffers. Then, pressure to increase legal immigration to fill labor gaps. Economic necessity overrides political restriction. Immigration continues through legal channels instead of unauthorized ones. Same demographic impact, different mechanism. After the wall, what? Scenario 2. Mass deportations remove millions of unauthorized immigrants. Result: communities devastated. Families separated. Economic activity disappears from regions dependent on immigrant workers and consumers. Social trauma. International condemnation. Then, some deportees return illegally because economic incentives remain. Others are replaced by new immigrants facing same economic pressures. The cycle continues because root causes aren't addressed. After the wall, what? Scenario 3. Complete immigration restriction stops all immigration. Result: demographic stagnation. Aging population with no young workers to support it. Labor shortages across economy. Social Security and Medicare financially unsustainable. Economic decline. Then, forced to reopen immigration because demographics require it. Population aging is catastrophic without immigration offsetting it. Restriction proven economically suicidal. Every scenario reaches same conclusion. Enforcement without addressing root causes only creates temporary pause before pressures reassert themselves. Building walls doesn't eliminate reasons people migrate. Deportations don't fix economic disparities driving immigration. Restriction doesn't address demographic realities requiring immigration. So after the wall, nothing changes fundamentally. The same forces operate, possibly through different channels or timescales, but ultimately producing similar outcomes. This is why the question is never asked. Answering it honestly reveals enforcement futility. If enforcement succeeds, it creates problems requiring new immigration. If enforcement fails, resources were wasted. Either way, demographic and economic realities eventually override enforcement efforts. The wall has no endgame. There's no scenario where wall is built, immigration stops, and America achieves stable resolution. There's only endless enforcement, spending billions perpetually without permanent resolution. Or policy change, addressing root causes, creating legal pathways, accepting demographic reality. Current politics chooses endless enforcement because it provides political benefits, demonstrating action, satisfying anxious voters, without requiring politically difficult solutions. But endless enforcement is unsustainable. Eventually, budgets face constraints. Eventually, demographic change creates political coalitions opposing enforcement. Eventually, economic necessity requires immigration regardless of enforcement. Eventually, someone asks, what are we achieving with all this spending? And the answer will be, nothing permanent. Just expensive delay of inevitable change. That's when the question, what comes after the wall, will be answered honestly. Nothing comes after the wall. The wall is eternal band-aid on problems that require surgery. It's expensive political theater substituting for actual policy solutions. It's symbol of action without strategy, enforcement without endpoint, spending without purpose beyond short-term political benefit. After the wall, what comes is the realization that walls don't solve problems rooted in economics, demographics, climate, and global inequality. But that realization will come too late, after billions are spent, communities traumatized, and opportunities for better approaches missed. The question nobody asks reveals the answer nobody wants to admit. The wall leads nowhere except to more walls, more enforcement, more spending, more futility. There is no after the wall. There's only the wall, endless, expensive, symbolic, and ultimately pointless. Demography is mathematics. And mathematics is indifferent to politics. The demographic destiny approaching American has been calculable for decades. The trends are clear, the timelines are predictable, and no policy can substantially alter the trajectory. The math is simple. White birth rates, below replacement level, 1.6 births per woman. Population maintained only through immigration and counting multiracial births. Latino birth rates, above replacement, 2.0 births per woman. Higher than white births, creating compounding growth. Age structures, white median age 44, Latino median age 30. Older populations die faster than they reproduce. Immigration, even if completely stopped, existing populations' age structures and birth rates continue producing demographic change. Add these together across decades. 2026, white 58%, Latino 19%, Asian 6%, Black 13%, multiracial 4%. 2035, white 53%, Latino 22%, Asian 7%, Black 13%, multiracial 5%. 2045, white 49%, Latino 25%, Asian 8%, Black 13%, multiracial 5%. 2060, white 44%, Latino 28%, Asian 9%, Black 13%, multiracial 6%. The trajectory is inexorable. It's being driven by births already occurred. Children born today will be adults in 2045. They're already here, already counted, already determining future demographics. Age structures already set. Population pyramids show age distribution. Young Latino populations will have children who will have children, compounding growth. Deaths predictable. Actuarial tables show when current populations will die. Large white baby boom generation is aging into mortality. No policy can significantly change these trajectories because the mechanisms are biological and mathematical. You cannot legislate people to have more children. You cannot prevent people from aging and dying. You cannot deport American citizens whose births drive demographic change. Even extreme policies, completely stopping immigration, mass deportations of unauthorized immigrants, revoking birthright citizenship, would only delay timelines by 5 to 10 years while creating humanitarian catastrophe. The demographic destiny arrives on schedule regardless. 2045. America becomes majority-minority. 2060. White population is approximately 44%. 2075. Latino population exceeds 30%. The precision may vary slightly. The direction is certain. This is what makes immigration restriction politically futile as demographic strategy. You're fighting mathematical inevitability with policy tools that can only slightly delay, not prevent, demographic change. It's like trying to stop aging through willpower. You can take care of yourself, delay some effects, but ultimately time is undefeated. Demographic time is equally undefeated. The wall cannot stop births. Deportations cannot prevent aging. Restrictions cannot reverse population momentum. All enforcement can do is make the transition more painful, separating families, traumatizing communities, wasting resources, without changing the ultimate destination. Demographic destiny arrives on schedule because it operates on timescales longer than political careers, through mechanisms beyond governmental control. The babies being born today will vote in 2044. The teenagers in high school today will be parents in 2035. The demographic momentum is already in motion. Politicians can resist, but resistance is futile. Like trying to hold back the tide, you can build barriers that temporarily redirect water, but the tide comes in on schedule regardless. Demographic tide is coming. The schedule is known. The arrival is inevitable. The only choice is how to respond. Option 1. Accept demographic destiny, invest in integration, build inclusive society that works for diverse population. Option 2. Resist demographic destiny, waste resources on futile enforcement, create trauma and division without preventing change. Current politics chooses option 2. But demographic mathematics doesn't care about political choices. 2045 approaches. The destiny arrives on schedule. And no wall, no enforcement, no political resistance changes the fundamental mathematical reality. Demography is destiny. The math has been done. The results are coming. Whether politics accepts this or continues resisting, demographic destiny arrives, punctual, inevitable, indifferent to human preferences. The Berlin Wall didn't fall because it was weak. It fell because it became irrelevant. Maintaining the division was no longer politically sustainable. Trump's wall will fall the same way. Not through protests or dramatic dismantling, but through slow erosion of political will to maintain it. How walls fall. Phase 1. Maintenance becomes questioned. Why are we spending $2 billion annually maintaining a 30-year-old wall? What security benefits does it provide? Could these funds be better spent elsewhere? Phase 2. Budgets are redirected. We're facing infrastructure crisis, climate challenges, education needs. Can we afford wall maintenance? The wall isn't preventing crossings anymore. Cutting maintenance won't change security situation. Phase 3. Slow deterioration begins. Some sections aren't repaired after storms. Desert weather corrodes unattended areas. Breaches aren't immediately fixed. Phase 4. Abandonment accelerates. Once deterioration begins, it compounds. Damaged sections make adjacent sections more vulnerable. Nature reclaims what maintenance doesn't protect. Phase 5. Selective preservation. A few sections near tourist areas are maintained as historical sites. The rest crumbles. Phase 6. Archaeological relic. Future generations study the wall as historical artifact, wondering why their ancestors spent billions on monument to demographic anxiety. This process takes decades. But it's inevitable once political coalition supporting the wall loses power. And that coalition is demographically doomed. It's overwhelmingly older, whiter, rural, all demographics declining. The coalition maintaining the wall won't exist in 2045 to 2050 in numbers sufficient to sustain political support. Gen Z and future generations won't maintain infrastructure they don't believe in, that serves no purpose they recognize, that wastes money they need for other priorities. The wall falls through irrelevance, not because people actively oppose it but because they stopped caring enough to maintain it. This is how most historical monuments disappear. Not through destruction but through neglect. Maintenance ceases, nature reclaims, and eventually only fragments remain. Hadrian's Wall wasn't torn down. It crumbled over centuries as no one bothered maintaining it. Many sections of the Great Wall of China are ruins, maintained in tourist areas, abandoned elsewhere. The Trump Wall will follow this pattern. Sections near cities might be preserved as parks or historical sites. Remote sections will be abandoned to desert weather and neglect. Within 50 to 75 years, large sections will be ruins, testament to early 21st century demographic anxiety. The wall falls not through protest but through irrelevance because the demographic change it attempted to prevent will have already occurred. The political coalition that supported it will have been replaced by generations with different priorities. The economic costs of maintenance will seem unjustifiable when the wall serves no recognized purpose. The wall becomes monument to bygone era, interesting historically but functionally useless. This is the wall's ultimate fate, not heroic last stand successfully holding back invasion, but expensive failure slowly crumbling as no one bothers maintaining it. The wall falls. Not with drama. With indifference. Future Americans will pass decaying sections and barely notice, the way we pass historical ruins from eras we've moved beyond. The wall's fall is inevitable. Not through destruction. Through irrelevance. And irrelevance is already approaching, carried by demographic change, generational replacement, and the simple mathematical reality that political coalitions are mortal while demographic trends are inexorable. The wall stands now. It will fall later. Not because anyone tears it down, but because no one cares enough to hold it up. February 19, 2026. 3 weeks after Bad Bunny's Super Bowl performance. The wall stands. ICE continues raids. Politicians promise more enforcement. And America continues transforming, exactly as it would have without the wall, exactly as demographics predicted, exactly as cultural forces demanded. This is the wall that cannot hold. It cannot hold back births. Every day, more Latino babies are born than white babies in the United States. The wall doesn't affect birth rates. It cannot hold back culture. Spanish-language content streams millions of times daily. The wall doesn't affect algorithms. It cannot hold back time. Older Americans opposing immigration age and die. Younger Americans embracing diversity come of age. The wall doesn't affect generational replacement. It cannot hold back economics. Industries need immigrant workers. Consumers want cheap products made possible by immigrant labor. The wall doesn't affect market forces. It cannot hold back love. People marry across racial lines, creating mixed heritage children who embody the demographic change the wall was built to prevent. It cannot hold back history. The territories defended are territories conquered from people now returning. The wall doesn't change who was here first. It cannot hold back mathematics. Demographic projections are calculable decades in advance. The wall slightly delays but cannot reverse mathematical inevitabilities. It cannot hold back the future. The future is being born now, in hospitals across America, to families of all backgrounds who are creating the diverse America that approaches regardless of walls. This documentary examined a paradox. America fighting cultural war it already lost, building physical barriers against forces that operate digitally, resisting demographic change through enforcement that cannot affect births. We saw the ironies. Colonizers fearing replacement they inflicted. Immigrants' descendants opposing immigration. English defenders in Spanish-named territories. Deportations from conquered land. Bad Bunny singing Spanish to millions who chose to listen. We explored the mechanisms. Cultural penetration through streaming platforms. Language acquisition through voluntary engagement. Demographic momentum through births and age structures. Intermarriage creating families where boundaries blur. Economic integration despite political exclusion. We revealed the futility. Walls that cost billions without preventing change. Enforcement that traumatizes without achieving goals. Policies that resist mathematical inevitabilities. Political theater substituting for strategy. And we identified the future. 2045, Majority-Minority America arrives on schedule. Gen Z, bilingual, diverse, comfortable with change. Integration, through culture, not policy. Resolution, time defeats resistance. The wall represents last gasp of demographic majority attempting to preserve dominance against inevitable transition. It will fail, not because it's poorly constructed, but because it's addressing the wrong problem with inadequate tools. Physical barriers cannot contain cultural forces. Enforcement cannot reverse demographic mathematics. Resistance cannot prevent historical change. The wall that cannot hold is holding, temporarily, physically blocking some crossings, symbolically demonstrating commitment to restriction, politically satisfying anxious constituencies. But it cannot hold against forces larger than any wall. The births happening daily, the culture flowing hourly, the time passing inevitably, the love transcending boundaries, the future arriving regardless. America will reach 2045 as majority-minority nation. Spanish will be widely spoken. Cultural diversity will be baseline reality. Intermarriage will be common. The demographic change will be complete. And the wall will still stand, or its ruins will. Monument not to successful defense but to futile resistance. Future Americans will ask, why did they build it? The answer, fear. Fear of losing familiar world, fear of demographic displacement, fear of cultural change. And they'll ask, did it work? The answer, no. Demographic change occurred on schedule. Culture penetrated completely. The future arrived as predicted. The wall that cannot hold is lesson about limits of power. Physical power cannot control cultural evolution. Enforcement power cannot reverse demographic mathematics. Political power cannot prevent historical transformation. Even $53 billion, 734 miles of wall, tens of thousands of agents, millions of deportations, all this power cannot hold back forces that operate through mechanisms power cannot reach. This is the wall's truth, impressive as engineering, imposing as symbol, irrelevant as strategy. It stands, but it cannot hold. The culture has already crossed. The demographics are already changing. The future has already arrived. Bad Bunny sang in Spanish to 100 million Americans. They listened, they streamed, they enjoyed it. That's more powerful than any wall. Culture that people choose cannot be walled out. Language that people want to learn cannot be enforced away. Future that people are creating through their choices, their families, their lives, cannot be prevented by barriers. The wall that cannot hold teaches final lesson. You cannot wall off the future when you're living in it. The future isn't approaching from outside. It's being born inside, in hospitals, schools, marriages, choices, streaming habits, language acquisition, and the simple mathematical reality that time moves forward and demographics change. The wall stands at the border. But the real border, between past and future, between resistance and acceptance, between fear and adaptation, runs through America's soul. That border cannot be walled. It can only be crossed. And America is crossing it now. One birth, one stream, one marriage, one Spanish phrase learned, one demographic shift at a time. The wall cannot hold. It never could. And the future knows it.